Fali nam još minut.
Good morning to everyone. A very warm welcome on this coldish, autumnish, rainish day. Welcome to the Presseclub Concordia, which is the oldest press club in the world, founded in 1859. And I very briefly want to welcome you on behalf of the organizers and thank you for being here with us. We have a great program this morning. Of course, our keynote speaker is Professor Joseph Stiglitz, and the organizers really want to thank, I would like to thank Mirjana Tomić, who is really has been in the engine room of this. And without further ado, I'd like to give her the floor.
But you didn't mention who are the partners.
I thought that Misha Glenny would do that, so we wouldn't repeat ourselves. So Presseclub Concordia, the Institute for Human Sciences, and we're very glad to have the Rector, Misha Glenny, here with us, Forum Journalismus und Medien, and of course the Erste Foundation, without whom this does not happen. And within the Institute for Human Sciences, it is the Europe's Futures Fellowship Program.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivan. Good morning. My name is Mirjana Tomić. Some of you know me from Zoom. I'm a former journalist, and now I curate and moderate seminars on current affairs for journalists and academic researchers. Just a few words about the content, and then I will ask Misha Glenny to give the welcome speech or welcome greetings. The idea of today is to understand what do we expect this winter. You're from different countries, but if you live in the German-speaking world, like I do now, you hear that this winter will be very hard, that we may not have a heating, that there may be rationing. At the same time, we are still not in winter, so we don't really know what will happen, and we hope that our speakers will explain what will happen this winter. And the idea is to see the big picture, the global picture that Professor Stiglitz will explain, economic picture, and also from the ground, the context for European countries, what type of political reactions can we expect to this winter? Is it a question of the wolf is coming, or will wolf really be here? And I would like to welcome, first of all, Professor Stiglitz, who found the time for us in his really busy agenda. I would like to thank all of our speakers, and I'll say their names: Andreas Busch, Gilles Paris, Marta, Párdavy, Pavol Demeš, Julian Popov, and Olivia Lazard. The order is the order of appearance. I would like to thank everyone here, as well as everyone online. And the format will be rather simple. The idea is that we listen, and then that questions are asked and probably even discussed. There will be 2 big breaks so that everyone can network. So the format is Professor will give an input of 20 minutes, and then there will be Q&A, then a break. Then we shall have a panel of speakers from Germany, France, Slovakia, and Hungary. As you immediately can guess, 3 countries that are affected by the gas issue and others. And France, that is a big European economy, so let's see how they will face this winter. Of course, the war in Ukraine will be present, and so I hope that today we and by the end of this morning, we understand a little bit more what is happening, whether it's all about wolf, and if the wolf is coming or not. I really don't know. And with this, I would like to invite Misha Glenny to say a few words. Misha, please.
Thank you, Mirjana, and let me start by thanking Mirjana Tomić especially for organizing this and other similar events, collaboration between Concordia Presseclub, fjum, and the IWM, and in particular, Ivan Vejvoda's program, which he runs, Europe's Futures, which is a particularly fruitful program funded by the Erste Stiftung, the Erste Foundation, which I'd also like to give a special thanks to. I have to say that this is a very odd occasion for me because it's the first time that I've been on this side of the podium in the Concordia Press Club. My office, when I was the BBC correspondent, was just down the corridor here, and I used to come here all the time to listen to the wisdom of politicians and people like Professor Joseph Stiglitz. It's a strange change of career at my time in life, but enjoyable nonetheless, particularly when I'm able to introduce events like this. I cannot begin to do justice to the achievements of Joseph Stiglitz, and so I'm not going to try. Suffice to say that he is a Nobel laureate, and to my mind, anyhow, the most incisive critic of both globalization and neoliberalism that we have in the world today. And as such, his comments and his wisdom and his interpretation at this moment are especially important. So I think we're all pretty privileged to be sitting here to listen to what Professor Stiglitz has to say. So without further ado, I will hand over to Joe Stiglitz and, sorry, from the Presseclub Concordia itself.
Thank you. I won't keep you much longer. It's, there's really not so much to add. Welcome, Professor Stiglitz, distinguished speakers, participants in this room, and participants online. We have a large crowd also participating in online, and I'll be handling the questions. Concordia has, as Ivan already mentioned, a really long history as an advocate for press freedom and for being the lobbyist for outstanding journalism. So we're very glad that we have this occasion for analyzing and debating a very complex issue. This is what our role is, and I hope you have all a good workshop. Thank you.
There we go. Yeah. Well, thank you, and thank you for this occasion to sort of reflect on some of the things that are going on. It's obviously a time of turmoil, of great uncertainty. I'm sure Misha would like you to all go to the, I guess it's sold out, but this series on an age of uncertainty. I'm going to focus particularly on the economics, but it's going to turn out, my view is that the economics really depends very much on the politics. We're in a peculiar situation where there's a debate going on about whether the world is about to face a serious recession, an economic downturn, and inflation. And normally those two are the opposite sides of the coin. If the economy is weak, you have deflation. You've been worried about deflation. When the economy is strong, you have inflation. And this goes back to a period, we haven't had this combination of a weak economy and inflation for a very long time. In understanding whether that will occur, there are, as I said, lots of uncertainties, many of which we have very little control over. There's the war. How long will Putin continue this war? there are some questions to resolve on the part of Europe and the United States, which I'll come to later. We are still, COVID-19 is not behind us. I notice most people here are not having masks, but COVID-19 is real in China. And that's important because China is the producer of the world. And if there's a problem in China, there are supply side problems. And those supply side problems are behind the inflation. So that's a big uncertainty. We can't do very much about either. We can do some things about, strategically thinking about how to induce Putin to act in a more rational way. But when you're dealing with somebody who is irrational, figuring out how to change behavior is really difficult because it's by their nature unpredictable. And actually there's an aspect of game theory where you want to pretend to be irrational, even it's rational to at least pretend to be irrational. So we don't know whether he is rationally irrational or irrationally irrational. And that's just, we have to deal with that uncertainty about whether, what is the nature of Putin. And we could do something about COVID-19, but very little about COVID-19 in China. So we have to understand the limits of what we can do. But a lot of the uncertainties about the winter in Europe are about the politics in Europe. And a lot of what is going on, a lot of the pain that was referred to, is self-inflicted. The basic stance that I would take is Europe and the United States is at war with Russia. It's a war of, Russia has broken international norms, it's attacked a neighbor, it's broken, and by breaking international law, I think there has to be resolve of the West to stop this. It's so understandable why a place like Presseclub should feel very strongly about it, because Russia does not honor anything about freedom of press, freedom of speech. And so anybody committed to those human rights should think this is a war that we have to win. And I'm certainly on that side, that this is, I am basically against most of the wars, against the war in Iraq. I wrote a book about that, the war in Afghanistan. Those were wars of choice that I think we were very foolish. This is a war that has been imposed on us by Russia, seeking to expand its borders. We can talk about whether we played with the tail of the wolf and got it angry. I don't think there would have been any difference if we hadn't played with the tail of this wolf. I think it's a war of restoration of the empire. But whether that's, whether we helped aggravate that wolf or whether this is just a war of restoration of empire doesn't make any difference in my mind. We have to make sure that this kind of aggression is not allowed to occur. Europe has been, Borrell and other European leaders, I think, have been much clearer in defining what I just described as the objective of the war than the United States, which has sometimes gotten confused, particularly in the Republican Party, because they describe it as a war of democracy versus authoritarian. It has an element of that, but when Biden went to Saudi Arabia to get additional supplies of oil, it made it clear that our side is not a side of democracies. We have many despots on our side. But these have not attacked another country. So, I wish we need to clearly see the world as divided between authoritarian regimes and democracies, in which the authoritarian regimes are expanding. But this particular war is a war to try to stop Russian aggression. But it has to be seen as embedded in a broader conflict of democracy versus authoritarian regimes. And that how we conduct that war, obviously, is going to affect how we win, how we conduct the narrower war may affect how we do in the broader war. And I'll make some remarks at the end about how we're failing in that broader war against authoritarianism. But most of my remarks are about the narrower war, about Russian aggression. My main concern is that Europe and the United States, as I said, have not realized that we are at war. And when countries go to war, they don't just leave their economy as if it was at a peacetime. Wartime economies are different from peacetime. You still use markets, but you control markets a lot more. There are shortages, and there's a natural politics of not wanting to admit you're at war. It's what the United States has done in every war that it's engaged in since World War II. We've tried to pretend that we're not at war. We call them special operation. No, that's what Russia calls it. We don't have names for it, but we have not declared war since World War II. So we try to say it's something else, but it is a war. And Russia has imitated us in that way. And as we went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, we tried to tell American people this was just, a few mercenaries. No, we don't call them mercenaries. A few people that we recruited, poor people for mostly African Americans, for whom this is the best opportunity to go forward. It's terrible that American society for African Americans this often is the best opportunity for them. But those are the people who've been fighting our wars. And it's been very clear that we don't want mainstream Americans to feel that we are at war when we go to war. And I believe Europe is trying to do the same thing now, and the United States. We don't want the kind of sense of insecurity, threat that war is often associated with war, and the sense of disturbance, the kind of debate. But it seems to me so clear that, but Europe particularly, by not owning up to the fact that it's at war, will in fact make the people suffer a lot more. Now, let me first talk about the inflation and the way we are responding to it. And again, my argument is that the way the central banks are responding to it will cause a much deeper recession or downturn than is necessary. This is a policy mistake. The idea is a very simple one. Most inflation, almost all inflationary episodes, except for a couple, have been caused by excesses of demand. This, like the oil price shock 50 years ago, is caused by a supply-side shock. Shortages that began under COVID-19 and nothing to do with the war. And that was the impetus, and now those problems have been exacerbated by the war. And once you see it through that lens, you realize that raising interest rates is not going to do very much about the problem. So the original in the United States, at the core of the inflation early on was used cars and new cars. And that was caused by a market failure. The car companies, except for Tesla, forgot, to order chips. It's a market failure. And that chip shortage resulted in a car shortage, and we let markets work, and the result was prices went up. It wasn't as if we didn't have car plants. It wasn't as if we had forgotten how to produce cars. As it wasn't as if we had been at war and some of the plants had been destroyed. No, it was just a shortage of chips. One critical part of a car resulted in inflation. And differences in the way we measure inflation between Europe and the United States explained a very large fraction of the difference in inflation. So people looked at the differences in inflation and tried to interpret it with all kinds of stories. It was a measurement problem. We used different metrics for measuring used cars in particular. There were a whole set of shortages. Many people thought at the beginning that the shortages were transitory, and therefore the prices increases were transitory, and they have proved more permanent than was expected. All that that says is that we thought the market was better than we should have. The market was much worse. And that's part of the, Misha talked about my critique of neoliberalism. It was short-sighted. It didn't invest in resilience. And nobody could believe that our economy was had as little resilience as it did. So when somebody says, they underestimated inflation, what they were really saying is they overestimated the competence of markets. And markets proved really bad. Poster child of that was the fact that the United States couldn't even have massive shortages of baby formula of the kind that you saw in the Soviet Union. Empty shelves. Women feminine products. Why? In that particular case, every one of these shortages has a different story, or many stories, and I could go through each of them, but we don't have time. But the baby formula shortage was we had allowed markets to get more and more concentrated. Market power. We didn't do anything about it. One company produced half the baby formula. It wasn't a question of globalization. It was one American company produced half the formula in the United States. And when that company didn't pay enough attention to health, short-sighted behavior, putting profits ahead of the health of the babies, and they were found out, they were shut down. And that created a shortage. The market is supposed to be diversified, small firms, all competing against each other. That's not the American economy that we have today. So the American economy proved very unresilient and is taking time to resolve these supply side shortages. Good news is some of these, like automobiles, are being resolved or will be resolved within a few months. But it's taken a long time. But meanwhile, there are things in China have gone very badly, and there are all kinds of shortages that are likely to show up. The good news is a lot of the shipping bottlenecks have been resolved. So it's a mixed picture with a lot of uncertainty. But that provides sort of the background for why there was an underestimate of inflation. It was a excessive confidence in markets. But then, on top of that, we had the war. And here, at the very beginning of the war, many, with Russia being a large producer and Europe being so dependent on Russian gas, it was clear that there was going to be an energy crisis in February and March. And it should have been clear that once Ukraine showed its resolve to win, it should have been clear that something should be done about that. Now, economists are, Europe was when the sanctions were imposed, among economists, there, you might say, two views. One, very hard to impose global sanctions on a commodity like oil, and that circumvention is very easy, unless you have global support. And here is a aspect of this war that I think one has to take into account. In the beginning, the first couple of resolutions at the UN, Russia got almost universally condemned, except by a few extreme authoritarian regimes. But if you've been following it, support for the war has waned in the third world. And the West, and particularly Germany, has a lot to blame for that. Because the context, as I said, is that we are just been through COVID-19, and we engaged in vaccine apartheid, vaccine hoarding. The West, miraculous development of the mRNA vaccines in record times, production. But when India and South Africa came knocking on our door and said, can we use their intellectual property? We have the means of producing this drug if you just allow us to use your intellectual property. Germany said no. We'd rather see your people die rather than our drug companies take a hit. Even though the framework of compulsory licenses had been agreed upon in the Uruguay round when the WTO was set up, and renewed when we faced the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the drug companies had devised ways of dragging their feet in the complexity of our mRNA, which enabled many patents, made it such that compulsory licenses were, the principle was there, but we needed an answer quickly, and they were not set up. So it wasn't a change in the framework of international law. It was a recognition that at this moment of time, we needed to act quickly, and a waiver of intellectual property rights. We succeeded in persuading President Biden that this was an issue of global concern, and he advocated for it, but Germany said no. And that was vital in stopping access to vaccines and central to today's lack of support for the West. Of course, coming on a history of colonialism and oppression and all that, but it is the feeling at the moment couldn't be stronger. So once you recognize that you don't have global support, obviously other countries are going to want to get your oil. So Russia's gas dependence was, Germany's gas dependence on gas was very, very foolish. I wrote about this in my book, Making Globalization Work, back in 2006, where I said, you know, Russia is not a reliable supplier. And because gas substituting for it is much more difficult, it is foolish for Germany and Europe to be so dependent on Russian gas. Obviously, Germany didn't pay any attention to what I wrote then. But it didn't take a genius to see that Russia under Yeltsin and then under Putin was not reliable. And yet you put all the eggs in one basket in a particularly, theory that interdependence would lead to good behavior. But it was a theory that I think no one today would support. So at the beginning of the war, as I said, it was either clear that the sanctions would not work because circumvention was easy, or that they would work and the price of oil would go way up, unless Saudi Arabia responded. And Saudi Arabia has not responded. So we have a peculiar situation actually right now that economists find a little bit difficult to understand. It's partly political. Saudi Arabia could have produced more, and that would have made a difference, but it hasn't. Circumvention has been very strong. Some estimates of the global supply, the difference in global supply is relatively low, and that makes it hard to understand the magnitude of the increase in the price out of sync with the magnitude of the reduction in supply. Well, a lot of this is markets don't operate very well in the short run. The price has come way down, and as an economist, I look at this and say, the long-run price of oil, we know what that is. I mean, the long-run price of energy, we know what that is. We can produce almost as much renewable energy as we want at a very low price, the equivalent of probably well less than $60, $50 a barrel of oil, much less. And that's the cap where we're going to be. And so in my mind, this is a temporary aberration in the price of energy and oil. What we should have done back in March is to have massive expansion of renewable energies to full capacity, using the equivalent of what we have in the United States called the Defense Production Act. Realize you're at war, commandeer resources, say this is not a peacetime economy. We used the Defense Production Act during the war against COVID-19. Australia used the equivalent of a Defense Production Act. So they realized that there is a war against COVID-19, and we went beyond market mechanisms. We should have done that here. But making the disturbances of the coming winter particularly bad in Europe is that the structure of the energy market is very flawed. It was based on a neoliberal view of energy, structuring the energy market, of deregulation. You divide it into three parts. It was something that we tried in the United States. I don't know if many of you remember when California deregulated. And it was a disaster. There was market manipulation. This is even without a war. We had market manipulation, prices went way up. There were all kinds of stories about what was underlying it. The right said, oh, it's because the left is trying to regulate, is trying to push renewable energy. If we just had dirty coal, all would be well. So they tried to blame it on all, on attempts to have a better environment, environmental regulation. And then we figured out it was market manipulation. And we re-regulated, and all the shortages disappeared. Prices stabilized. And Europe should have learned that lesson. You might say the one good thing about that was Enron, which was the company engaged in that market manipulation, went bankrupt. So it got its punishment from the market. But the basic story is so clear of what's going on right now is clear in the United States. We are energy neutral. We don't import or export energy in the United States. So there is no, what's going on, you might say, in the rest of the world shouldn't make any difference to us. We don't depend on Russian oil. And yet, prices of gas and oil have gone way up. They're not coming down. What was it? It was a massive redistribution from ordinary customers to Exxon and the other oil companies and gas companies. Did it have much incentive effect? No. Nobody does oil exploration or even opens up a fracking gas field on the belief about prices today. It had no production incentive. It had a little bit of incentive of people to conserve, but very little. And you could have done all the incentives that you needed at the margin without the redistributive effect by using nonlinear prices. So there was a lack of imagination about that. But even if you hadn't done that, you could have had windfall profits taxes. They were windfall profits. Capturing those profits and then redistributing it to the people who are suffering. It's the second best way of doing it. Using nonlinear prices would have been a lot better. But Europe, things are even worse. You take a country like Norway, which is a net exporter of energy, and price of electricity has gone up multifold. And people in their country say, why are we paying more for electricity? The water doesn't cost any more, and the hydroelectric or gas doesn't cost any more, and yet our citizens are suffering an enormous amount. What's going on here? Why should they pay for this war in that way? And again, I think it's all politics. It's all about the European energy market and how it's structured. So what I've tried to argue here is that you could have organized it differently. You still can. You could have made more efforts at a European level to produce more energy quickly. Couldn't have made up fully for the gap, but the gap is in the global energy market is much smaller because of the magnitude of circumvention. So it's unfortunately, a tariff where you try to take advantage of transaction costs to make sure that Russian gas and oil gets a lower price. Hard to fully implement, but that's where we are now, months and months after the war began. That should have been at the very beginning. And it should have been obvious that that's what you needed to do, so that even as Russia sells the gas and oil on the global market, it receives less. Let me say, just as a parenthesis, the import restrictions are very effective. Not allowing Russia to have chips, depriving of access to international financial markets, that side of the story is a very effective mechanism. So I'm very strongly in favor of those sanctions and trying everything that one can. But when just the sanctions against oil are a delicate matter that was not well managed. It was right that we should try it, but it was not done well. Well, where are we going forward? Well, I hope that Europe wakes up and realizes it's at war and changes the economic response. I am not very optimistic about central banks waking up. It's almost in their DNA that when they see inflation, they raise interest rates. They don't want to be irrelevant. It's just the nature of politics. If you're given a job, you do it. And you hear that, we're behind the ball, all kinds of stories like that. So, unfortunately, unless the voices on the other side get louder, what is going to be going on is what I use, the analogy I use is medieval bloodletting. I don't know if you know, medieval bloodletting, what they do is, the theory was that you had bad humors in your blood and you had to let them go, out, so they took blood out of you when you had a disease. Now, did people recover when you let out their blood? No, usually they got worse. But how did the medieval bloodletters, they had an ideology. How did they respond? They said, the problem is we haven't let out enough blood. And they let out more until the patient died or God intervened. And he didn't intervene very often. Well, that's where the model of central banks. If you want to, they will raise the interest rates until they get inflation under control. Raising interest rates operates with long and variable lags, usually 18 months, and inflation will not be controlled. It won't affect the supply of oil and gas and food and all that. We know how to produce food, but it's not. Raising interest rates actually makes it more difficult, because it makes it more difficult to make the investment that you need. And there's another theory that in imperfectly competitive markets, raising interest rates encourages firms to focus on the short run, and that means raising their prices. So it's actually something that is counterproductive. So it won't solve the inflation problem. And what are they going to do? Raise the interest rates more until the patient dies. Well, the patient here dying means we go into recession. Deep enough recession, inflation does get tempered. So I am very pessimistic unless there is enough political pressure on our central banks to make them wake up and say, we're in a different world. I hope that those who are responsible for the European energy market realize, too, that a lot of the high energy prices are self-inflicted and change the way the European energy market works. If they do that, the winter will be much better than if they don't. Should I say a word about America, or should I stop and open it up for questions?
Let's open it up for questions, sir. Well, thank you very much. Wow, that was quite the broad-brushed but deep insight into the flaws of the modern neoliberal world that we're working in, and you have unveiled some of the mist that exists around all of these issues. So I'll open it up. We have 15 minutes for Q&A, so please raise your hand and do introduce yourself. Yes, please. And just wait for the microphone, please. We'll take 2 questions and then come back.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this insightful speech. I'm Karolina Zbytniewska from Poland, from Euractiv. You said that central banks need to accept that we are in a different world, in a war economy. So if you could tell us what exactly should they do when they accept that?
Okay, and we'll take...
Point by point.
We'll take one more question back there, please.
Thank you. Monica Graf, Salzburger Nachrichten. More or less same way of question. You said the European energy markets should change. In what way should they change? What is the first or second things they should do? Thank you.
Thank you. Back to you, Joe.
Good, okay. The thing that central banks should do is to recognize that this is a supply-side inflation. And, you know, there are some things that are beyond your control. And you should, sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. So they should say this is a kind of inflation that directly is not in our hands. And we're just going to accept it. You know, we've gotten a disease here, and it has to run its course. Rather than giving it the wrong medicine, it's better to recognize the limitations that we have. But when you say that, you should give some note of optimism. When the inflation broke earlier, they made a mistake and they said it's very temporary because they thought markets were more resilient than they were. But they could have said, look, if we make the investments in renewable energy, the price will come down faster. But even if we don't, we know what the long-run price of energy is. It's not going to continue to go from 30 to 60 to 90 to 120 to 240. So the idea that it would continue to rise at that rate, and therefore there would be that kind of inflationary momentum from energy, just as wrong. There's a natural limit to that, to that inflation. In fact, it goes the other way. That we know that when we don't use renewable, depletable natural resources like oil for a while because price is high, we have more oil in the future. And what does that mean? Well, if we're going to be getting our target of carbon neutrality by 2050, we have more oil around. And what does that mean? After this episode, prices are going to fall even more below the path that they were on. So we could have given, a realization that this is a temporary episode of inflation and that there will be disinflation. The same thing, cars, inflation, but then there's going to be disinflation because cars are going to go back to normal price. Food. We've spent 50 years telling farmers not to farm. We could tell farmers to farm. It's a revolutionary idea, but we could do it. We probably won't have to because prices will come back to normal. But if there were any inkling that they were not come back to normal, we just tell them, go farm. So there are so many forces restoring these sectoral demands. One way of thinking about it, monetary policy is about aggregate demand, and these disturbances were sectoral demand. And they're real, and they're demand versus supply, but they're sectoral. And blunt instruments like monetary policy don't do that. Now, in other countries, there is a recognition that you can use monetary policy in a more fine-tuned way, but that goes against the neoliberal model of Europe. What do I mean by that? You could say, we will provide at low interest rates capital to anybody that wants to invest in renewable energy or in food or in any of the other shortages. Let's target monetary policy to increase the supply of things that are in shortage. Now that's a radical idea. But I think it's a common sense idea. You wouldn't want to do it normally because in more normal times, markets are working relatively well. But this is war. And that's why I say there is just not a recognition. They're too wedded to the wrong ideology. Now, the same thing is the answer to your question about the energy market. Deregulation, I said, never worked. The characteristic of the European energy market that's most salient here is that the price of electricity is related to the highest cost source of production, the marginal cost. And economists are very, very wedded to marginal cost pricing. And they believe it's the basis of efficiency. And in normal times, there's a lot to be said for it. But you can still do that, and that's where I talked about nonlinear pricing. You say to consumers, you pay the same price for energy that you did last year, as long as you consume less than 80% or 90% of what you consumed last year. But if you consume more than 90 or 80 to 90%, you pay a much higher price, and if you consume more than 120%, you pay even a higher price. And obviously, you make exceptions for people who are in special circumstances and so forth. Well, that's a system where if you just consumed 80 or 90%, you have no bigger bill than you did before. But at the margin, you have a lot of incentives. But if you use what we call linear prices, make them pay that high price for all they consume, you know, if they're spending 5% of their budget on energy, on electricity, and you allow the price of electricity to go up tenfold, that's 50% of their budget. People can't do that. And an element of common sense and humanity would have said, you don't do that. So there are many ways of restructuring the energy market. I just gave you one example, and it's obviously much more complicated. But the basic idea was electricity price was linked to the highest cost, the marginal, and that was gas. And when gas went up tenfold, the price of electricity went up tenfold. And as I said, in Norway, it didn't cost any more for the water. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated because climate change has affected the supply of water, and a lot of other things are going on. But the average cost of production did not go up anywhere near in tandem with the price of electricity, and you could have used marginal cost pricing at the margin and protected people.
Great, we'll take two more questions here in, wait for the microphone, please, Paul.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Pavol Demeš. I am from Bratislava, Slovakia. I have two questions, one America-related, and second to you and George Soros-related. First one, for us looking at US and US leadership, and you very rightly said that we live in over-dominance of politics today, over economy and over everything, practically. How come that after all what Donald Trump did, he still can think about running for president? And second, George Soros is a rather demonized person in our region, and surely you know him well. How different you and him are in assessing today's economic situation, and namely, how to get out of all those troubles which we are seeing in economy? Where you agree and where would you disagree with George Soros?
Just behind you, Pavol, please.
Good morning, Mr. Stiglitz. Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Olivia Lazard. I work with Carnegie Europe, and I'm associated with the IWM. As you mentioned, the recession is supply chain related. How much credit do you give to European wishes more than plans to reindustrialize at home? How much does it conflict at the moment with the type of neoliberal policies or monetary policies that you were talking about? And how much does it conflict with the debt crisis that is coming?
Okay.
Okay. Well, no. We'll take one here, and then the one in the back, and that's it. Sorry, we're strapped for time.
This is from our online audience. And it's from Aline Götz, who is an Austrian freelance editor residing in Greece. Her question is basically what you said about the supply side nature and the demand side, but sorry, I'm in the wrong question. As you already hinted, it's not very likely to expect a turn in government's response actions. So the question for normal citizens, quote unquote, what can we do to make pressure on governments and the energy market in order to see a reconsidering of current strategies?
And then finally back there.
My name is Andreas Busch, I'm from Hungary. You have been criticizing neoliberalism and globalization. So what would be the solution in Europe? And what do you think about the stakeholder capitalism? Is it a working option or not?
State capitalism.
Stakeholder capitalism.
Stakeholder
capitalism. Okay, 4 questions there. Joe, back to you.
Okay, let me try to answer as much as I can in a few minutes. One interesting aspect of what is going on right now is that even though I've been critical of how the neoliberal model has impaired the ability of Europe to respond and imposed enormous cost on European citizens. In fact, the model is so bad that many of the, you might call it the strictures, the dogma of neoliberalism are being put aside. So you have cognitive dissonance is running wild in Europe in a way that I find very interesting. So at the one hand, you're keeping you're on the energy market, you're talking about caps, you're doing things that are really outside of that framework, but you're not thinking about it from first principles, so you're not doing enough to change the model. And the result of that is some really strange things. You have Germany nationalizing a major company. You're having massive state aid, which is against all the principles of the single market. In the United States, we, having spent 40 years castigating China for industrial policy and telling people at the World Bank and IMF don't use industrial policy, passed a $250 billion industrial policy bill to produce more chips and other things in the United States. Ideology is sort of being set aside in an incoherent way. And the international institutions, when the United States passed the CHIPS Act, almost no one said, is this consistent with the WTO? The WTO was viewed as irrelevant because when we do it, it's justified. While when China does, totally unjustified. So we are beginning to live in a world of intellectual incoherence, and I think that's in a way because neoliberalism is a broken model, but people are finding it difficult to leave it, and they don't have another mooring on which to rest. So one of the things that is going to be, there are going to be many consequences of the dramatic rise in the interest rates. I think it's going to put a lot of stress on the euro. Obviously, countries with high debt GDP ratios are going to be finding it difficult, and there are several, particularly those countries that have not, where their debt is publicly held and they have short maturity structures. So, and that means that looking at different countries, they have different maturity structures, different amounts of debt. It's going to be very variable, but in the third world, I think we're going to see a lot of debt crises, and that's going to, again, color the global response to what is going on. One of the responses to I thought a good question was, what can ordinary citizens do to change this? And I think the first is to recognize the nature of the problem. And what is Europe and America is at war. Wartime economies are different than peacetime economies. The neoliberal doctrines never made any sense, but they become particularly problematic in the midst of a war. That the kind of incoherent response is creating all kinds of tensions and inefficiencies, inequities, and that rethinking the model in a more systematic way is, which you can do. I mean, we had the tools, we can do it. You can do the reforms in the energy market a lot better than the way that they have been done. The broader issue on the nature of capitalism, where is stakeholder capitalism going? That was supposed to be a softer version of capitalism in the United States. Friedman, 52 years ago, wrote an article about shareholder capitalism. The only objective of capitalism is to maximize shareholder value. And if you make money off of causing an opioid crisis or a childhood diabetes crisis, that's their problem. Your duty is to your shareholder. And particularly in the short run, because the markets are supposed to look forward, and if you make money now, that's all you need to focus on, because the market is for. That view obviously has been rejected, the shareholder capitalism. But stakeholder capitalism is an improvement over that, where you supposedly look at your customers, your environment, your workers. It's a improvement, but stakeholder capitalism, American style, has a lot of greenwashing in it. That is to say, the rhetoric says, I care about my customers, I care about the environment, until it hits my bottom line very much. So green light bulbs are great. They don't cost very much, and I can talk about how, by putting green light bulbs, I've saved a little bit of money. But I've been in seminars with banks where, as they praise how they put in green light bulbs, they're lending for coal. So I have some skepticism. It's better than shareholder capitalism, but it's not enough. And finally, let me say, how does anybody looking at the United States understand what's going on? And the answer is you can't. The fact is that one of the two parties has largely become a cult. And the best way to understand what's going on is to read some stuff about Salem witchcraft or something like that. How do societies get caught in a cult? One of the two parties, 80% of their members, major party, believes the election was stolen, is enthralled with QAnon, doesn't believe in science, doesn't believe in experts, and has created a culture of their own and a lens through which they see the world. And it is such a different lens that, I think most of us don't know how to break into their worldview. So if you don't believe in science and you're trying to explain about climate change, how do you do it? If you're an anti-vaxxer and you don't believe in science, how do you reach them? And those are really hard questions, and questions that as Americans or foreigner, non-Americans, I don't think there's any answer. But there's a very strong implication, I think, for Europe, that with this being such a dominant cult in the United States, and with America's very flawed democracy, where we don't have majority control, we have minority control, we have gerrymandering, we have voter suppression, we have laws that are designed to make sure that a minority controls the country, unless, designed 200 and some years ago by rich, white, male slave owners. So we have a political system that is dysfunctional. And that means Europe has to rely on its own defense forces. And the world has to rely on Europe for the preservation of human rights and democracy, that you cannot look across the water. I hope things work well in the United States, obviously, for me, for my family, for everybody I know. But I think that gives an even greater importance that Russia gets defeated in this war of aggression.
Joe, thank you very much. We are now going to have a coffee break till 10:20. This was fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time. And as Joe at the very beginning said, he will give a lecture tomorrow night at the Technische Universität within the framework of the Vienna Humanities Festival. You do have a program of the Humanities Festival, so those of you who are already not aware, please do inform yourself. There's a terrific week and a terrific weekend lined up. So please join me in thanking Joe.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Ivan. And now we have 20 minutes to digest what was said, to discuss, and then we shall speak how this whole overview, let's say, how is it reflected on the ground, how citizens perceive it. So a little bit of we sigh now with all this. Thank you.
I don't practice law. I'm not an economist.
Neither am I. I'm a political economist, so...
Yeah, but you're closer.
I'm closer, yes. But
Hello. I hope you have digested a little bit what Professor Stiglitz has said. And now we shall start with our panel, where we shall discuss how people actually perceive what is happening economically and politically. The word resilience has been the key word, or the mantra, as I say recently. We have to resist in economy. Sweden has even introduced the Ministry for Psychological Resilience, an agency. So I would like our panelists from France, Germany, Slovakia, and I'll introduce them, and Hungary, to explain how are the citizens of these countries prepared for this winter? Are all these warnings something that people take seriously, or they think politicians will solve the situation, it will never happen? And my first question will be, and then I will introduce the four speakers. Professor Stiglitz has spoken of war economy. I have not heard, at least in the media that I listen to, that anyone really speaks about war economy and speaking when addressing the citizens. So that will be my first question, but before I would like to introduce our speakers, I will first ask Gilles Paris. He is writer, journalist, columnist, editorial writer in Le Monde. I'll say immediately why first France. France, because it's a big European economy and it is not as dependent on Russian gas as the economy of other three countries we have here present. The second, I will ask Professor Andreas Busch from the University of Göttingen to reflect on what is happening in Germany. Who would benefit politically? Is it the far right or the far left? Or everyone trusts the government, it will be all fine? Then I shall ask Pavol Demeš. He's a civil society expert, TV anchor, and works for German Marshal Fund in Slovakia. It's a very special case in some ways. There was recently a poll, and over 40% of Slovaks said they would like Russia to win this war. So I would like Pavol to explain a little bit this. And then Marta Párdavy, she's a lawyer and co-director, co-founder of Hungarian Helsinki Committee. Well, Hungary is openly on the side of Russia, but the question is, will it benefit the government if economic hardship really comes? So the first question to Gilles, war economy that we heard Professor Stiglitz speak about, are people aware of it or not?
Yeah,
please.
My first response would be not at all. But it's funny that you mentioned the terms of war economy because Emmanuel Macron mentioned the severity of the situation in August. And he was almost Churchillian in his speech. Of course, you won't be surprised hearing that Macron is somewhere posturing on something. But I think that he felt that a wake-up call was most welcome because France was looking at the war in Ukraine from a long distance. It's far from us. And I would say that maybe 90% of the French people were unable to put Ukraine on the map before the start of the war. And France thought for a long time that it was protected by his famous French nuclear power. The fact is that we have a perfect storm concerning this source of energy because maintenance was postponed for 2 years due to the pandemic, but the industry suffered a lack of investment after Fukushima. And it came as a shock for the national pride to see that something is going wrong to nuclear electricity. So it's fueling some anxiety already present in the society.
But tell me, when I read the French press, still the question of prices is very much present, and the French have the tradition of protesting. Do you see any protests coming? Or do you see anybody really benefiting from it, like Madame Le Pen?
You heard, of course, about the tariff shield, which was decided by the government. So the energy prices are rising, but it's still much lower than the average of most of the countries of Europe. And the inflation is also lower. Still, there's a popular dissentiment among the society, but even before this situation to start. And I would say that we had already an insurgency in 2018, 2019, the Yellow Jacket, which was connected with an energy crisis. And what was interesting is that nobody among the political parties were able to gain from this mobilization, a huge mobilization. And so I'm not sure that the political system, even if there is also inside him a big share of protest vote, of protest movement, I'm not sure that they would be able to gain from this situation.
Thank you very much. By the way, Sputnik did get, because this was the media that gave the voice to Gilets jaunes. Professor Busch, how would you describe the situation in Germany? when it comes to the mood. German media has, I will quote what Spiegel wrote in English, "These days it is difficult to tell where to draw the line between pessimism and justified panic."
I would say that the mood is serious but calm. There is no acute crisis. The spot market prices for gas, on which Germany depends a lot, have actually been going down since the end of August. There have been 2 stress tests conducted for the stability of the electricity system, and they've both been published, so everybody can see that there are no expected major interruptions. Germany has managed to actually, just to say that Germany imports about 95% of its gas, and about half of that came from Russia prior to the war. Now nothing comes from Russia. Germany is still operating. Germany has managed to diversify, to store, and to reduce consumption. Supply has been massively increased from Norway and the Netherlands, and there will also be LNG terminals. Germany hasn't had that in the past. There will be 2 that will be operating in the course of this winter. In the meantime, there is a substantial buffer of a massive storage capacity. Germany stores 24 billion cubic meters, and they are now 90% full. So this has been actually since the beginning of March, immediately after the beginning of the war. This was all put on a crisis footing, and every attempt was made to fill up these storage tanks. So this has increased gas demand and has driven up prices, but they're not going to rise further. That is the rational expectation. The consumption goal within the EU is actually going to decrease, to actually reduce consumption by 15%, and Germany is party to that. And at the same time, one has brought old coal power stations out of retirement, and there is a debate about whether nuclear is going, the nuclear phase out, which is planned, will be going on as planned. My hunch would be that it will not actually go on as planned. If you look at opinion polls, then 85% of Germans are in favor of at least extending that until the next summer. And even 3/4 of Green supporters are in favor of that. The question is, what about the Green Party functionaries? But that's what I would expect. So in that respect, calm but serious. So no acute crisis, and the German state has been very active, both in terms of energy policy, but also in terms of fiscal measures, which have been massive. There have been 3 packages, which overall total something like 95 billion euros to basically buffer the fiscal consequences, both for consumers and for firms.
Yes, but German media is not as optimistic as you are.
No, but then you're a journalist, so you know if you cry that there is a crisis, then you will be listened to. If you explain things in calm and measured terms, there's been much less excitement about that. So let's stay calm. Let's not exaggerate the crisis, because any doing so is actually just doing Putin's business.
Well, I'm sorry, but the mayor of Berlin the other day on a German TV show was discussing whether Berlin was ready for serious power cuts of several days. Do you think that was a problem, that was a media hype, or it was a reality?
I'm not in the business of defending anything that the Lord Mayor of Berlin has said. She is not a well-known energy policy expert, so I'm not going to comment on that. But I can only reiterate, I would not take these individual assessments of panic to be the real situation. Let's try to look at this in a calm and measured way. And if you do so, and there's actually a lot of information out from the federal government and from various other agencies, although, of course, I have to agree with Gilles that Scholz doesn't really do Churchill. So Macron is very good at that. Scholz will have to find his inner Churchill at some point.
Thank you. Pavol, explain to us the situation in Slovakia. It's a country that depends on Russian gas. What is the economic situation, and how can you explain that over 40% of the population would like Russia to win this war?
Thanks. So I'm in between two superpower representatives, country of which will turn 30 only coming January, which is still in search of mythology of state and where and how we belong to. For 18 years, we are EU NATO member, but we are in between East and West, culturally, religious-wise, historically. So when this public opinion poll occurred, many of us were in shock, both domestically, and many international friends were writing me, and I was telling I need to look at methodology first, but methodology was apparently quite okay, because it was done by Academy of Sciences. But I think that you need to look at this is a combination of real crisis with energy, politics, war economy, and political mess, which we have. Because after journalist Jan Kuciak and his fiancée were killed in 2018, whole country's politics went on mode, bring justice, bring state back to people. And we thought that new government, led by Igor Matović, most bizarre politician in 3 decades, had 2/3 majority in parliament. We thought that he will be cleaning the mess and bringing justice, but suddenly COVID came and war came. And these parasites on fear and uncertainty of people, both coming from far left, far right, and even some who were socialists like Robert Fico, formerly 3-time prime minister, they started to misuse fear of people most bizarre way. I never thought that this would be possible. And as far as data is concerned, Globsec conducted survey, Slovaks, our population, is most vulnerable to Russian propaganda, and we are most vulnerable to hoaxes. So this is fact. So for that reason, Russian hybrid warfare played very successfully in Slovakia. Government needed to do something with that. 35 Russian embassy people were fired or sent home this spring. And so for us, if you take into combination of vulnerability of people vis-a-vis Russian propaganda machinery, combined with over 90% energy dependency, oil, gas, and nuclear, I think that those who are misusing situation and spreading anti-American feelings and claim that war is about America and Russia, people suddenly can be manipulated most bizarre way. And with influx of refugees, which became reality of the war, we have close to 100,000 of them, I think that people are reacting, let's stop the war, America is problem, Russia is problem, but I think that this is a result of that survey which you refer to is, I think, result of poor management of politics, because Igor Matović became least popular politician within 2.5 years, winner of the elections, and Robert Fico trying to come back and rescue himself vis-a-vis criminal charges. So I think that in Slovakia we have mixture of poorly managed politics with real crisis, which is related to war in our eastern neighbor.
Well, as you know, journalists love to speak to taxi drivers, and I was this summer in Slovakia for a private visit, and the taxi driver said, it is easy for you in Austria because everyone is going to get 500 euros. We are not getting anything in this country from our government, and we have to send weapons to Ukraine. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that all these issue of weapons, we are the most pacifist country in the region. If you go to Vienna, you have horsemen everywhere, heroes. In Slovakia, we have poets and literary figures. We don't have any generals, admirals. So somehow this military issue or defending ourselves and how to handle things. So we were for 1,000 years part of Hungarian kingdom, and 70 years part of Czechoslovakia, and somehow we were never thinking about sort of going out there and sort of having military operations. Plus, we have experience from 1968, where 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops came, and they stayed with us until 1991. We know how it feels to have temporarily stationed 100,000 troops. And so also from deeper past, Russians were part of our national awakening period. So giving arms which are killing Russians or which are killing brother Slavs in Ukraine. So there is this pacifist nature in it. And the most bizarre thing was when we got German soldiers coming with American Patriot system on our soil. This was discussed that, okay, they are going almost, even if we are NATO member, for government to translate that we are eastern flank country and we need to protect all NATO vis-a-vis Russian aggression was very tricky thing how to explain it. Also this S-300 system, which we provided early enough, luckily, new Prime Minister Heger and our President, Foreign Minister, Defense Minister, all of them are very clear-cut on that. But unfortunately, opposition was misusing massively this issue of arming, selling, giving arms, that this is perpetuating war and so on. I think that we have this clash between official position of the government vis-a-vis this undercurrent misused massively, mostly via social media, social networks, by current opposition, which is trying to get rid of government. And lastly, since the theme is uncertainty, I think I do not know whether this government will last and how long it will last, whether former Prime Minister Matović will be dismissed after tomorrow's session of the parliament or not. So I think that we are living in this, unfortunately, in this political turmoil and infighting within coalition and coalition government, coalition versus opposition. And people are not getting clear-cut answers and leadership, and population is highly split on attitudes towards this conflict and also how to handle upcoming energy crisis. Even if we have only about 6% unemployment, we are per capita largest car producer in the world. Economy is doing quite fine. New Minister of Economy just announced that we don't have imminent gas or electricity crisis until end of year. Prices are fixed, but the fear which is pumped into public space because of this political infighting is creating this fear among people that what's going on upon us.
Thank you very much. Marta, well, we don't have a problem of communication in Hungary because Hungary communicates, Prime Minister Orbán communicates his ideas quite clearly about energy, about his position towards Russia. However, he does have problems with Brussels, so the money may not come to Budapest. Do you think that the population can resist this winter with, or the friendship with Russia or whatever companionship, I don't know how to call it, can save Hungarians from a cold winter?
Yeah, thank you for that question and also the previous ones. And as I was thinking about it, the Hungarian mood among citizens is probably described best as anxious and uncertain when they look into their wallets and the expectations on their bank accounts. But it is disappointed and certain when it comes to who's in government. So will this lead to a political shift in Hungary? The disappointment about the assurances that the Prime Minister and his party showered on Hungarians during the beginning of the year, saying, we will save you from the soaring energy prices, our deal making with Russia is successful and ensure the stability of the very strong energy utility price caps that have basically made Hungarians live in blindness to what energy prices are costing. This disappointment is a real wake-up now for many Hungarians, I think. Now in September, private citizens, private consumers are getting energy bills that are 7, 8, 10-fold to what they were before. So it's not a gradual increase, but a sudden turn. And this is, of course, it flies in the face of the electoral promises. But then when you look at whether this would mean any change in political power and the composition of power, it probably will not yield any change. And so this uncertainty in reality is also coupled with certainty in politics, and that certainty is propped up by, as you said, the very strong and pervasive messaging that maybe with the exception of online media space, really is seamlessly spread to Hungarians. And much of this messaging, of course, is meant to undermine the effectiveness of EU sanctions, the effectiveness of having a strong position against Russia, and it is basically very favorable to the Russian narratives. This also props up, of course, a very strong political support that otherwise, without such a skewed media environment, would probably not be in place to that extent.
Do you think that the opposition has any maneuvering playground to benefit from the situation, or the whole country will be poorer and poorer with one leader?
So the maneuvering playground, as you put it, is certainly there because it's maybe we haven't had such a chance to see some rule of law improvements as now. And this is sadly not an achievement of the Hungarian opposition, but rather an achievement of European politics and the consequence of Hungary's membership in the European Union. As you all know, the rule of law issue has been on the table and has been investigated and found wanting for years in Hungary. And this year, the European Commission, I think to quite a lot of people, it was very unexpected, and they were doubting, but the European Commission did decide to trigger the so-called funding conditionality mechanism, basically finding that EU funds are so much at risk that they should be potentially suspended when it comes to Hungary. And Hungary really now especially depends on this EU funding. And so this, I think, very important and very welcome step from the European Commission has led us to a situation where the Hungarian government has really done an about-face. If you look at the way they communicate, a few months ago we were persecuted, it was said, by a witch hunt that was just based on Hungary's anti-migrant policies and policies that favor the conservative values of family. And now the government is really seeking to appease both the Commission and all EU member state governments, putting forward a package of measures that are meant to ensure a stronger anti-corruption framework. And so we will, I think, see some improvements through this. This is absolutely a top-down, sort of from the EU institutions. This will, of course, not be a magic weapon. It's not going to be comprehensive in terms of the scope of the changes, but it could bring about improvements to the anti-corruption framework. So as a human rights organization, we're very disappointed, and we think far more should be done, for example, at least in the field of independence of the judiciary. And there's a lot of money on the table, and there's still the COVID recovery fund on the table, where the Commission should actually go beyond what was already agreed. But this will be, if at all, the driver of the change. And as I say, we can't expect too much from it, given the comprehensive nature of the Orbán's regime, which, as you all know, was just labeled 2 weeks ago as a hybrid regime of electoral autocracy. So within an EU member state, I think this is quite outrageous, and I'm very outraged myself as a Hungarian citizen of this.
Thank you very much. As Professor was mentioning the war, and as I started, do you think that I'm not speaking of the European Union, do you think that European citizens will resist this winter? Will they be resilient? That is question number one. And question number two is, in Austria and in Germany and in Italy, there are more and more voices that say probably we shot ourselves in the feet or in our foot when we declared sanctions against Russia. And even, you know, in public media, you would have people, citizens say, did we really have to do it? I have to close my bakery. I have to do this and that. Do you think that the government support is enough to go through this winter? And we don't know what the next one will be like, because Professor Busch was talking about the money Germany will give. But what will happen? I'm only a journalist. Well, how much money is there to be given? What will be next year? Gilles, please.
Thank you for the question. I would say that the public opinion in France is still supporting the sanctions. And it's clear-cut. There's around 40% of the people who are supporting the sanction, whatever the price for their own life.
But we are not still in winter.
Yes, of course. It's September, so we have to, it will be declining, I'm sure. But 32% were ready to support the sanction until a certain limit, and only 27% were already against the sanctions. But the war in Ukraine is such a no-brainer that it's such an easy situation to understand that there is, people agree on the fact that we should sanction Russia and that we should help even militarily Ukraine. And there is question about the efficiency of the sanction, efficiency of the military aid, even if the last counterattacks in Ukraine was good news for the government, but still the mood is in favor, definitely in favor of Ukraine. The fact that the government is spending so heavily to lower the price of energy also deprive the oppositions, because we have three main oppositions in France, of room of maneuver. They cannot say a lot of things. And as I mentioned, I think one of the biggest problems in France is maybe that we have a dysfunctional political system. We have a traditional party which are disappearing, but which have still a network of elected officials, but there are fewer and fewer voters, and we have movement built around personality. Macron was one of them, but it's the case also with France Unbowed, La France Insoumise, around Jean-Luc Mélenchon. It's the case also with the National Rally, Rassemblement National, with the far right, even if Le Pen is a familiar name in the French politics. But those parties have no organization. There's only one guy or one woman, in the case of the National Rally, who will set the agenda and take the decision. And I'm not sure that they are well positioned to feel the mood of the people and to translate it into political proposals or policies. So I'm afraid that this disconnect between the public opinion and the political system would worsen the crisis. If we look at the last cycle of election we had, at the first round of the presidential election, which is very important in France, something around 56% of voters decided not to go to the poll, to vote with a blank vote, or to support the National Rally or France Unbowed, which labeled themselves as anti-system. And if you look at the first round of the parliamentary election in June, something like 45% of the people decided not to go to express their vote. So that's a problem.
Thank you very much. Professor Busch, where would you place Germany in terms of, do we support the sanctions? Will it be resilient? I know you're an optimist, and I would like you to bring some optimism here.
I'm not an optimist. I'm not an optimist. I'm neither in the business of being optimist or pessimist. I try to be an analyst. And I'm also not in the business of making predictions. I can make assessments, and the reaction obviously will depend on the depth of the crisis in Germany. Now, as I've tried to outline before, there is at the moment no indication that there will be a serious energy crisis in Germany, and we must not talk it up. We must not feed the attention economy. We must not give fodder to the trolls. If we look at political support, actually we have a good measuring rod, because today, a year ago, the federal election was in Germany. And that resulted in the so-called traffic light coalition. The minister in charge of most of this, apart from the finance minister, has been the Minister of the Economy and Climate Protection, who is one of the leading Green politicians, Robert Habeck. His personal support has been down in the last 2 months. There's been unpleasant things coming from his ministry. And the Green support has also come down by some 5 percentage points. However, compared to last year's result, the Greens at the moment are still 4 percentage points up. So they've seen a very good development for them. It's been quite popular, and we need to see that. By the way, the federal election last year, and I think everybody needs reminding of that, in Germany resulted in a clear strengthening of the center. The center parties were strengthened. It was both the left and the right extremes which lost. Actually, the left party barely scraped into parliament at all. Just to remind everybody of that. In the coalition, there's been some infighting, particularly between the FDP and the Greens. This is about how you precisely which instruments do you use, at which point do you draw in a price floor, do you support individual customers? There is the famous gas surcharge. The finance minister was in favor of it because it meant that if the money doesn't need to come from government coffers, he can keep his hallowed debt break. On the other hand, he has now just learned, it seems, that a gas surcharge will actually feed into the inflation rate and therefore sort of propagate. And now he seems to make a ever so mild U-turn. So in spite of all this infighting, my prediction is that the German government is going to be stable, and if only then for lack of alternatives for all parties concerned. But also, the Germans are not in the business of quickly jumping ship. If you look at German governments, German chancellors, they are usually in the business for a long time. I'm not going to predict that Scholz is going to equate Chancellor Merkel's record, but it doesn't look like it's going to be a substantial insecurity or imbalance in the present government. And if you don't take my word for it, Mirjana, look, I ask you to look at the Lower Saxony regional election in 2 weeks' time. That will be a test. And if there are no substantial changes there, I think you should calm down your worries. We should not emphasize single voices. Of course, there are always single voices. I talked about why there is an incentive to do that. Now, lastly, your question about support for Ukraine. Support for Ukraine is very strong in Germany, and it is surprisingly so, and it is surprisingly stable. If you look at opinion polls, and I have the gold standard for that is the Politbarometer, which has been going on for a very, very long time. When I looked it up, I was actually surprised myself that the support for Ukraine did not waver over the summer. If you ask people the question, are you in favor of Germany supporting Ukraine in spite of the rising prices and energy prices, you get a 70% yes. That is a lot, and it hasn't changed since July. So that is when the energy crisis actually developed. So that's very stable, and it's even more interesting if you look at the supporters of the various parties. In spite of what many people will think, Social Democrat supporters are in favor by 82%. That's a 4/5 majority. If you look at the Green Party supporters, it actually looks like 30 years ago in the old socialist countries, 97% in favor. The Liberals, 3/4 in favor, 74%. The Christian Democrats, 73% in favor. The only party that, of course, deviates from that consensus is the Alternative for Germany. It's the right-wing populists. But even they have come up from July, from 15% support of Ukraine in spite of rising prices to 30%. And the left party, which is at the moment actively deconstructing itself and is probably going to split in the next couple of weeks or months, even their supporters support Ukraine in spite of rising energy prices by 59%. So my message is quite clear. Based on what we have, the best opinion polls we have, if we ask detailed questions and if we evaluate the responses, it's clear that support for Ukraine, in spite of the rising prices and energy prices in Germany, is very strong and very stable. I think that's a very good message.
Thank you very much. I also have to, I want to open the floor for questions, but sorry, Pavol and Marta, I asked basically the same thing. Do you think the way things are going now, and considering government measures, that Slovak citizens will go through this winter without major problems? And, well, we know that the support for Ukraine there is different.
Yeah, generally, I think we will get through it, in spite of the fact that we have turmoil in politics. What we have difference, I cannot say that I can predict that government will last. Germany and France and Hungary can say our government will last. I cannot say that. And this is bringing this fear of uncertainty. Whatever new government composition will be, whether Fico and similar types coming back, whether they will bring, in order to create majority, some extremists to government and so on. So we have more domestic political uncertainty rather than trust in being member of European Union and NATO. I think that key anchor for our people is, because one would think that we are pro-Russian. We are not pro-Russian. Questionnaire was about ending war and stopping and so on. So for people, this is rather, but we are over 70% pro-EU, well over 50% pro-NATO, and we see that security guarantee, economic guarantee are related to our EU and NATO membership. And I think that this is critically important. Also, even if we are over 90% dependent on energy on Russia, nowadays, Prime Minister traveled to Italy, sign agreement with Italians, traveled to Poland, sign agreement with Poles to get southern and northern corridor. And so diversification of energy is becoming leading theme because we know that Russia is unreliable and we don't know how all of this will turn out. But we know that European solidarity and cooperation with neighbors and so on is critically important to survive that. And as far as support for Ukraine, I think, and it was big surprise, we were strongly anti-immigrant country before Ukraine war. Whenever immigrants, we don't have immigrants. Slovakia is the only country in EU we do not have a single mosque. So for us, anything coming from outside is a little worrisome and creates turmoils, but vast majority of people welcomed Ukrainian refugees and helping, and this was not about governmental politics, municipalities, churches, volunteers, and all of this. So I think that in this regard, helping Ukrainians, helping refugees, humanitarian assistance, military assistance, this is something which is already built in, and I don't think that this will change at all. Here we are part of rest of the European
Thank you very much. Marta?
So my expectation is that Hungarian citizens will really feel the crunch this winter. It's already happening because of these unexpected or uncalculated, extremely high surges in utility costs. This means that not only families, but institutions themselves have no way to finance this. So local municipalities and also governmental agencies and governmental services could not plan for this in their budget. So already there's talk about not only decreasing heating to 18 or 19 degrees, but also closing welfare institutions, particularly those run by the civil sector, and charities will be hit very hard. And as all crises, this is probably going to hit those who would need the most assistance the hardest. This will also be probably, sadly, similarly as in previous years, be a very polarizing, politically very polarizing period with an immense amount of government funding poured into propaganda. The Hungarian government probably has carried out surveys that indicate that the Hungarian population is not very supportive of the energy sanctions because it's so linked to the high cost of gas and electricity in the government's narrative. And so to boost this skepticism further, there's going to be a so-called national consultation, usually a very steered and manipulated set of questions posed to every Hungarian household, which could provide further political, well, it will serve the political support that the Hungarian government might need to flag in EU-level discussions for its position that sanctions are really harming us more than Russia. And this is consistent, and so Hungarians will, while feeling the devastating impact potentially of high prices, would also know who to blame.
Thank you very much. I open for questions. First Andreas, then Philip. Please introduce yourself.
So my name is András Németh, I'm from Hungary, and I have a question for all of you. So Mirjana said that in Sweden there is a special agency which is fighting propaganda. What your governments and civil society are doing to counter Russian propaganda in your own country, because it's a very important question. Sorry for Marta, it's difficult for you to answer because in Hungary, the main tool of the Russian propaganda is the national public TV, but what are the civil societies can do?
Thank you very much. The second question, and then Philip. Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Philip Nobel with Global Voices. This is a question mostly to Pavol and Marta and related also to the previous question. How do you explain this historical amnesia? I mean, you were talking about, of course, people still having been through, the Soviet invasion in '56 or in '68, and we see the success of the Russian propaganda and people not necessarily understanding that yesterday it was us, today it's Ukraine. And would you put the blame more on Hungarian or Slovak society, or the same from Czech? I'm from the Czech Republic, of not doing enough to look at its own history, or do you blame it solely on social media? Thank you.
Thank you. Who will start? You?
I would say that on the surface, the Russian influence is quite limited because we know who is conveying the Russian messaging concerning the Ukraine and the war. So it's quite easy to identify them and to contradict what they are saying. Under the surface, on Facebook, there is a lot of things going on, but there is no translation up to now in the public opinion or of a change of mood, of a change of the image of Putin, which is terrible. The image of Putin is terrible, and the image of the Russian army, especially after the invasion, is terrible. So it's a really an uphill battle for the Russian propaganda when it comes to the French opinion.
Thank you. Pavol?
Yeah, I think that Slovakia could be used almost as test case in this topic because there are a lot of minuses but a lot of pluses or approaches how to counteract Russian propaganda, because as I mentioned in my opening introductory statement, we are most vulnerable out of Visegrad 4 countries and to Russian propaganda. And this expulsion of 35 diplomats this year just proved people didn't know that we have so many Russian diplomats. If you kick out 35, how many more in 5 million country are they, and what are they doing? Also seeing live, Russian ambassador nowadays is like dissident, because before 24th of February, he said there will be no invasion. This is American propaganda. When invasion occurred, he was invited to our foreign ministry and he was running away from media. He was unable to comment, and now he's unable to comment anything. Moreover, Sergei Lavrov used to be like hero, doyen of foreign ministers in our region. Nowadays he acts as clown. He's disappearing from after his UN performance and he cannot comment on anything. So I think that Russians are showing their true faith through official diplomatic, political and other steps. Moreover, since it's neighboring countries seeing these atrocities, what are occurring across the border, and vast majority of refugees, what we have are mothers with children. And they are telling their stories, what's going on with their families and so on. So we have large-scale, quick education and learning process what Russia and Russian world and Russian vision of the world is all about. Moreover, there is one clash because Slovakia is quite religious still country, after Poland, most Catholic country. Watching Pope Francis and his performance, it's difficult even for Slovak church to agree with what Pope is saying. Lately he mentioned that arming Ukraine is morally justifiable because this is for self-defense. So for many priests and bishops, this is rather problematic just to repeat the words of the Pope. So I think that we see a lot of changes in this battle against Russian propaganda from various corners. And in structured way, government through Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interior, they created special units which have specialists now to how to counteract propaganda, because before that it was sort of obvious people can learn and find. Secondly, there is a lot of debate how to block Facebook, and Facebook is leading source of information in my country. So several members of political class had blocked Facebook because they were actively spreading Russian narratives. So this issue of freedom of speech, what to do with websites of pro-Russian media outlets, is a big topic, and how to block individual Facebook profiles or whether and how to do that. So now it's big.
And we are discussing this in an institution that defends press freedom.
Yeah, and last but not least, I think that I'm surprised how opinion-making segments within society, namely academia and churches of all denomination, how unprepared they are to deal with this war situation in general and with counteracting Russian propaganda. Church and academia, rather, they can talk about they need more money to heat student dorms, but they are not telling and how and what to do. So I think that it would be extremely useful if we would spread or learn from one another also how to revitalize this. And last but not least, media. Many serious media are having special sections and specialist journalists who are getting out these facts and figures and what are hoaxes on. So we have several very good journalists who became specialists on anti-Russian propaganda.
Thank you, Marta, and then Professor Busch.
Yeah, to the first question about what is civil society doing to counter Russian propaganda and disinformation, well, there is quite a lot of activities in Hungary that are carried out by civil society and independent media. There's important and really high-quality fact-checking and debunking sites. One is called Lakmus, for example, which is something that should be supported. There is also a lot of civil society organizations interested in countering but not knowing what to do. So definitely more support for this kind of expertise or the development of such expertise necessary. The social media platforms' responsibilities, I think, are key in this regard, but not only when it comes to Hungary, but all this cannot, be a really effective pushback when the disinformation is coming from the government or basically media conglomerates funded by the government. So it's always been remarked that there is no need to really spread disinformation from Russian sources in Hungary because we have sadly our own, and these are part of the propaganda media empire. So there's more to do, and certainly a focus at the European level on media freedom, not only in terms of protection against attacks, but legal and other policy measures to support plurality in media. Independence, particularly in public service media, is really needed, and I don't see this happening at all yet. When it comes to your question about historical amnesia, Ukrainian refugees, I think, were very well received initially by Hungarian citizens, and there was the same kind of outpour of spontaneous support that you saw elsewhere too. We have about 30,000 Ukrainians who have registered for temporary protection in Hungary. These are the individuals who have a right to be assisted and have a reasonable expectation to be assisted by the state. So when you hear the Hungarian government talk about 900,000 Ukrainian refugees who've been assisted, that basically means the door was opened for them and they were allowed to pass through the country, like many other refugee flows in the past. So this is a small number, and those who are involved in assisting them now that we're in the 7th, 8th month of the war, I think are under enormous strain. There is a high degree of burnout among those who assist refugees, but this issue is largely invisible. So that level of high outpour of support is not sustainable, of course, but it's also not matched by supportive statements or positions from the Hungarian public officials. So it's out of sight, out of mind for most, sadly.
Professor Busch, but make it short. I would like 2 more questions before we take a break.
I'll try to make it short. First, some of the resonance also actually comes from civil society. So civil society is not per se always on the side of the good. But in the German case, I think it's not very organized, although there is a resonance for some individuals who in the never-ending talk shows actually try to form their own personal brand around being controversial. Yesterday, they used to be experts on pandemics and vaccination. Today, they've effortlessly transformed into strategic experts. Fortunately, there are lots of real experts around from a number of institutions like, say, the European or the German Council on Foreign Relations. So we have wonderful people who are also giving expertise. And journalists, of course, need to be reminded that there is no reason why you should balance each expert with an idiot. Leave it to the experts. On the political side, there is sometimes a false sense of equivalence. If I have an expert from here, I need to have somebody who says exactly the opposite, even if there is absolutely no reason and no foundation for that. That should not be followed, and that is also a responsibility for civil society, for journalists as part of civil society. In terms of the political forces, it's actually bordering on the ridiculous. The AfD, that's the right-wing populists, they actually sent 3 politicians to the Donbass to look for themselves, but they actually got afraid once the shells really started flying and quickly retreated to the safety of Germany. In the Left Party, a former leader of the parliamentary party gave a rousing speech accusing Europe and the United States of starting an unwarranted economic war against Germany's main energy supplier, and the result was that several high-profile members of the Left Party who had endured until now actually left the party. So I think that overall the situation is healthy. We must balance it with freedom of expression. That's quite clear.
And without journalists.
No, but journalists need to be aware of the role they play and the responsibility they have. And I, for one, but that's just my opinion, think that we have a few too many talk shows. And they all try to differentiate themselves and to actually win in the marketplace. And you win by being controversial. And that's not healthy for the overall reasonable debate that we need in every society, in the German as well as in many others.
Well, thank you very much. Any other questions? Do you have any questions online?
There's no questions online. I might just add short question to Mr. Busch.
Okay, so now we have 2 questions and yours. You start, then Alison, and then Stephanie.
It's really just short, but one of the short-term reliefs is taking a lot of money. And particularly in Germany with the Schuldenbremse and all that, you're one of the main proponents that keep up the 60% thing in the European Union contract. So do you think that that's sort of softening, or how's that developing?
We shall get all 3 questions and then replies, and then we'll... Alison?
Yes, Alison Smale. I'm a freelance writer and former New York Times journalist. I only was prompted to put my hand up by this assertion of what journalists should and should not debate. I mean, I think we really have to understand that, yes, the free press plays a very big part in any democracy. But there's a lot more debating in newsrooms of false equivalency than you might think. And I just wanted to note that.
Thank you so much, Alison. Stephanie?
Very quickly, a little bit a different question from my side. My name is Stephanie. I'm director of the International Institute for Peace. My question would be when it comes to this whole energy crisis situation. I mean, we heard from Germany, they have been a lot more dependent on Russian gas, and Austria is the same. It's different, for example, for France. How do you see the possibility that, similar to what happened during the COVID crisis, that the European Union would actually come together and that we would together, I don't know, like find something like energy autarky, if we would like share and spread or whatever, because this could actually give us more resilience towards what is happening and also towards the propaganda and how you can influence the people on the ground. So how do you see this possibility of a common European Union?
Go to Professor Busch?
It goes actually to everyone. I mean, it's,
well, we have
yeah,
like
how do you
3
see the
minutes
possibility?
left.
We know it's difficult, yeah.
Okay,
well, so I guess you should...
First 2 were to me, so I'll leave the rest to the others. The debt brake softening, that's an interesting debate, or it's an interesting question. From a theoretical point of view, as a political scientist, I would say, well, there is a potential to swap softening of the debt brake to with softening of the nuclear phase-out. That would involve both the Liberals and the Green Party. I think the Green Party would be well advised to think about that, and the Liberals would also be well advised. It's difficult to predict, but I would not be surprised if there was some movement there. On journalists and discussions in newsrooms, I'm very aware that that is the case. I was not making a general judgment. I was just saying that there are a few media outlets in Germany where I would be grateful if that debate could be upped just a little bit.
And the question of Stephanie about energy?
I would say that the fact that we have already an integrated market for electricity is a good thing. It could be only reinforced with what we will face. So somehow it could reinforce the European Union, I'm sure.
Thank you very much. Well, now we have a break. We are a bit late, so may I give you 20 minutes? Oh, Professor, you wanted to ask a question? Please, go ahead. There is a microphone.
Yeah. A very brief question which is related to some of the remarks I made. And it's related also to the question about European cohesion. One of them is, more specifically, I mentioned that governments don't like to think of themselves being on wartime footing. What would be the response to European leadership if they said, you know, we really are at war and we need to respond, you know, an economic war, but Ukraine's troops, but our economic backing of that. And the second question is, I pointed out the failures of the European energy system. So the integration was a great thing, but they integrated on the wrong principles. So, and in some countries like Slovakia, they protected the citizens, and in France, they protect the citizens to some extent. The question is, in some ways, is there any recognition of the flaws of the system? I mean, obviously, there should be, and the willingness of governments to do something about it. And we've seen some of the peculiar thing, not peculiar, but the nationalization of the energy company in Germany. The policies of the EU went some way, but only a limited way. You know, the windfall profits tax was very narrow in its scope. There are private contracts. You know, the traders have bought a lot of electricity in some of the countries and are making huge windfall profits and are unrestrained from the price caps. And that was a result of lobbying by the producers. But all this goes beneath the surface, and the energy market is so complex that most people don't really realize what is going on. So the question is there any possibility of a political support for a more fundamental, at least wartime, revision of the energy framework?
Well, who will start? Will you start, Gilles, and then we go this way?
I think it's already on the table in France that to reform this electricity market is already a priority for sure.
Yeah, I may try to answer your question, Professor, related to this cohesion of Europe and the feeling somehow that we are in the same boat tackling with all of these issues, and also admitting that we are at war economy or whatever war. The very beginning, if you would look at how we were labeling what happened after February invasion of Russian troops, first, Putin used language, this is not a war, this is special operation. Yeah, and only now, when he had to mobilize, being beaten by Ukrainian forces, supported by us, he suddenly is showing this kabuki back home that this is probably war if we need to mobilize. And even he's not saying that this is mobilization, this is partial mobilization. So this playing with words is, if you look at how we labeled it, we called it Russian invasion or Russian what? And this was like local between two countries thing. Later on, we suddenly started to use that we are at war because Putin already started saying that collective West, we need to fight with collective West. We didn't know that we are collective West. Now we are collective West. We are supporting Ukraine and we are at war. So we are admitting it. And I think that it is extremely healthy for Europe and for transatlantic community that we are starting using this term, because with this irrational Putin Patriarch Kirill joint venture, this is going to be unpredictable. This is going to require on us sacrifice. And the sooner we label it properly, the better for us to design political strategy and psychological strategy. And here I fully agree with Professor Busch that we need to do everything not to show weakness vis-a-vis Russia, that we are nervous, that we are weak. We can win this only if we will say, well, we are much stronger than you, we are ready to fight with you, and there is no alternative for us than to defeat you. If we will not propagate this on daily basis, politicians, people, educational families, I think that he is winning because he counted on that we will be weak and he will be strong. And now he is in shock. EU led by women, Ursula von der Leyen, and she is traveling to Ukraine, she is with Zelensky here and there. Two female prime ministers, Finland and Sweden, decided to join NATO, and all of them are a bit in chaos in Russia, seeing unity and decisiveness of us, not to lose the war.
Thank you very much for your questions. I'll try to be brief and make 3 points. First, I don't think a war rhetoric is going to be helpful in Germany. This is about, to use the fabled British slogan, to keep calm and carry on. And so in Germany, at least, I would say reducing uncertainty is what is called for. Upping the rhetoric, apart from the fact that our present chancellor is not very good at that, is not going to help in my assessment. As far as the EU is concerned, yes, this is a crisis and the EU needs to deliver. It needs to show that it's helpful. There is a somewhat ironic theory of European integration, which is called the bicycle theory. It needs to be moved forward, otherwise it keels over. If you look at past crises, such as the financial markets crisis, it has actually led to further steps in European integration, like the EU semester and all that. So perhaps this is a chance to bring that forward as well. There is lots of discussion, particularly in academic circles, about the precise energy market design. However, politics is its own realm. It has its own logic. We've known that since Machiavelli. And economists need to recognize that. And so give it some time. I think if there are obvious flaws, then things will very likely this will be an opportunity to learn from the crisis. The EU has, in general, over the last decades, used crises to learn and to actually improve.
Thank you. Marta, a comment, short comment, because we are late.
So to learn from the crisis and to pool the resources within the EU to help us through this presupposes not only these sectoral solutions, but also that member states trust each other. At least they can trust the deals that they've made with each other, right? So that we would have sufficiently strong guarantees for that. And I think from a Hungarian perspective, this trust is not there and it shouldn't be blind. And when it comes to, for example, future mutual financing, something that could resemble the COVID recovery fund, I think a lot of member states are extremely cautious about this because they don't see that there would be strong enough guarantees that their taxpayers' money would not be ending up in the pockets of people who are otherwise interested and actively undermining EU unity. So it's not only, for the sake of principles, but also for the sake of very pragmatic reasons that I think we need to really ensure that this trust is followed up with the delivery of commitments. And this is why the rule of law conditionality mechanism, although now it concerns Hungary, but it has a very strong European dimension in the future. And this is why it needs to be, this is the moment, we have one shot to get this right. And otherwise, disappointment will also impact how we can work together in the future to overcome crisis. And this is a very risky endeavor now. So I think this is why we need to push for more. Just one last thought. So when it comes to EU unity, you might recall that about a week ago, there was a European Union position was proposed in the UN Human Rights Council, so that the European Union would have one voice to support a special rapporteur to be set up in the UN Human Rights Council to investigate crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine, and Hungary actually vetoed this. And so 26 member states had to speak on their own, and it happened, but Hungary actually blocked investigating human rights atrocities in Ukraine through the UN Human Rights Council. So I think when it comes to where is our EU unity, we really have to take a hard look at how strong that is at the moment and where it's going.
Well, I thank everybody for the thank you all for your thoughts, inputs. It gives a lot of food for thinking and for articles and further debates. We shall shorten the break to 15 minutes, but there are some little sandwiches so that you have enough energy to hear about, to listen about energy, which is our last debate that our two experts will speak in concrete terms about what to expect this winter and what to expect in the future with green energy. So there is about 15-minute break, and continue talking to our speakers and the professor.
Welcome to our last panel of the day, continuing to be a very exciting subject, and we're looking at one of the key issues related to the events, unfolding events with the war, and we are at war. Professor Stiglitz very clearly said that, and the second panel confirmed it. So we're looking at the question of energy, and we have two of the foremost experts on these issues in a broad and narrow sense of the word. Olivia Lazard, who is a fellow with Carnegie Europe. She hails from France, has done many things in her life before engaging in these issues in Africa and various places in the world. And we have Julian Popov, based in London, right? Who hails from Bulgaria, and he will explain to us the intricacies of the energy situation. We will then have a Q&A, and we'll finish sharply just before 1 o'clock. So, Olivia, you have the floor, and from what I gather, you have a presentation. We shall follow. And by the way, Olivia Lazard was a Europe's Futures Fellow last year with us at the Institute for Human Sciences.
Okay. You
can't see, so.
My job was made fairly easy by Professor Stiglitz's intervention this morning. I'd like to piggyback on a couple of things that you said. One is this notion of the war economy. The other one is the supply chain disruptions. About the war economy, we need to ask a key question, which is when the war ends. And by that, I mean, what is the end game for Russia? Does it stop with Ukraine or does it go beyond? Parts of what I'm about to present have to do with the future of energy in Europe and how we have to contextualize the future of energy in Europe into a larger global context in terms of changing of power dynamics at the geopolitical and geoeconomic levels, and how we're headed into a time of ecological, climate, and energy disruptions. The second thing having to do with supply chains is essentially the fact that, as Professor Stiglitz was saying, we currently have circumstantial supply chain disruptions. They're vastly associated to what is going on in China, to the fact that the pandemic is still heavily impacting the way in which China functions from an economic perspective, and the fact that China is indeed still the factory of the world. But I'll put another question to the floor here, which is essentially, what is the future of supply chains in a world where supply chains can actually be instrumentalized, manipulated, or even weaponized? And when that means something, essentially, for the future of energy in Europe. I'm gonna run through a few of the challenges that we have to reckon with in Europe going forward, starting with two important historical moments. The first one was when President von der Leyen took office, and she gave one of her speeches, which was about the Green Deal and the fact that the Green Deal was going to be the European man on the moon moment. I'm going to have to argue that in order to send people on the moon, you need some proper rockets and space vessels, and you need to actually have the machinery in place in order to build those rockets and vessels. We currently suffer from a lack of vision related to that. The second historical moment is related to earlier this year and the communication or the publication of the Repower EU directive, which is essentially Europe's response to the reorganization of energy within Europe and abroad as a result of the war in Ukraine. There's been a lot of focus on gas and hydrogen, but this is the very first time, if you look closely within the actual Repower EU strategy, that one, we have an international strategy, which did not exist with the Green Deal before. The Green Deal was made for Europeans, by Europeans originally, and it had never considered essentially the foreign dimension of energy, which is quite peculiar for a continent or for a region that is outsourcing a lot of energy and trying to import a lot of energy into its own territory to function as an economy. And the second peculiar thing about the Repower EU directive is the fact that for the very first time in our history, we started having some mention of critical raw materials as an international dimension of relations from the EU into the rest of the world, which is a very good sign. The part that is missing is essentially a whole lot of sequencing that need to happen in order to source materials in a way which is conscious of all the challenges that we have to grapple with today. We have entered into the age of what I call wicked solutions. We have to go towards decarbonization because we have a climate crisis, but this has a lot of implications which are going to bear heavily essentially on the ecological future of the planet, on the energy future of Europe, and on its place within the rest of international relations. Parts of the challenges that I want to run through go from basic physics to much larger issues of conflict and what in French we would tend to call conflictualité, or different forms of conflict that affect the world. The very first thing that we need to know about Europe's direction in terms of energy is obviously that we have indeed the Green Deal with a climate law. The climate law asks us to reduce our greenhouse gases by 55% at least by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. And in order to do so, we need to heavily shift towards a renewable energy mix. In order to do so, we need to find a lot more materials to obtain what we call the same amount of power density. What I mean by that is something very simple. 1 unit of coal, 1 unit of gas, 1 unit of oil produce that much more power density than 1 unit of solar energy contracted within a solar panel or within a windmill, or a wind turbine, sorry. What you see on this left-hand graph is essentially this representation. You have a high density of power and a low amount of space that you need in order to produce that power for fossils, and you have an extremely high need in terms of material intensity for all of the renewables. To give you but one example, in order to build an electric vehicle today, we need about 6 times as much materials and critical minerals as we do for a conventional car. And the entire energy system is going to be a lot more materially intensive going forward. So we're switching essentially from a fossil energy system into a mineral one. And what you see on the right-hand sides are the type of materials that we need. We're talking about rare earths, we're talking about cobalt, silver, lithium, graphite, tantalum. There is a whole list of a number of different materials that we need. It's not just that we need many, it's that we need many of them, because we're creating a compound economy of different clean technologies. And the particularity of those materials is that they are not rare by nature. They have a very low concentration in the crust of the earth. In order to produce, on average, 10 grams of copper, you actually need to extract about 1 ton of soil. This produces this type of mine to produce that much amount of usable material. So we're essentially shifting into a so-called green economy, which will push us to dig very deep into the environment, to dig very far and wide in order to sustain energy-intensive economies. Do we have the right production capacity to do this? Not quite. We know from market supply chains at the moment, in terms of projections, that copper is about to run very low, that there's going to be an outstripping of demand compared to supply within the next 5 years. It's the same for a number of other types of supply chains regarding rare earths, lithium, graphite, cobalt, etc., etc. We know now, thanks to benchmark minerals, that we need to open up at least 336 new mines to meet our decarbonization demands by 2035. So not only is that going to have a very high impact in terms of ecology, but we have to ask ourselves, where will the mines open up? And in order to figure this out, we need to figure out where the deposits are. This is a map that the International Institute for Sustainable Development produced back in 2018. All of the green dots essentially represent the many different types of materials that we need to build the decarbonized economy and energy system, their location, and their deposit size. This is a map which is not fully updated today. We're still discovering a number of deposits, but this is a map that gives you essentially a sense of where the various deposits are located in the world and how we're going to go about creating a new type of energy system, which is actually outsourced, for the most part, outside of Europe. We do have some deposits and some mining activities in Europe, but because of environmental concerns, because of legal standards regarding environmental, social, and governance standards, and because of environmental activisms, these mines are usually blocked from activity, which is something that we're going to have to probably review. In the meantime, we need to look elsewhere. And we need to look at all the places where you find the concentration in South America, in different parts of Africa, and quite heavily concentrated in the Indo-Pacific and Central Asia, which means that the future of Europe, in terms of energy, is outside of its borders and depends on a foreign policy that actually accompanies the industrial and technological policy that we're trying to put into place. Which is why it was extremely important right from the beginning to try and create a foreign component to the Green Deal, which was missing and which we're starting to build only now. The problem is that this map demonstrates something really important to notice. Behind the green dots, you see shades of brown and red. They represent the rankings in terms of corruption indices and fragility indices that all of these countries sort of score on. A lot of countries that are actually very well endowed in critical raw materials are also countries that tend to be fragile, that tend to have a high level of corruption and predation. So that means that doing business in those environments is particularly difficult, especially for companies that are stock market listed, which is usually the case for mining companies in the OECD space. The other thing which is complicated is indeed that we're facing essentially a potential for more inequalities in the way that business is done in those places. Because usually environments or countries that strong fairly high on corruption indices tend to strong very high as well on societal fragmentation, on marginalization, and on inequality. This is why it's also quite unfortunate that these countries tend to be highly climate vulnerable, something that the IPCC identifies as one key aspect of global fragility going forward. The more unequal a society is, the more vulnerable it is going to be to climate impacts, and therefore the more it is going to widen global inequalities, not just national ones, but inequalities between the global north and the global south. The other problem with where the deposits are located is quite simply that these countries actually host the most critical ecosystems that we need to regenerate and to protect in order to stabilize the global climate regime, the hydrological cycle, and in order to protect biodiversity. So we actually have a conflict and a tension between the decarbonization agenda and between the regeneration agenda, which is also strongly linked to the adaptation agenda. So there are structural issues at play here, which first and foremost concern the planet. We need to care for a planet that we're overshooting boundaries for. This is one thing. The other thing, which is concerning, is that we are now in a global environment where fragility can be instrumentalized as a means to pursue a renegotiation of the global balance of power. And this is where a larger and more complex picture regarding the role of Russia and China comes in, and why we need to sort of look at this balance of power and in terms of what it means for the future of Europe going forward. Usually, people tend to talk in terms of supply chains directly about China. I'll come to China in a minute. But I'd like to start with the role that Russia is playing. If you look at this map, this is a map of Ukraine, and it's a map of the deposits for rare earths only. Ukraine has a lot more different things. It has lithium, it has hydrocarbons, it has uranium, it has a ton of other types of critical minerals outside of rare earths. But rare earths are really important because the European Union is 98% dependent on China for rare earths, for the provision of rare earths for all of its industrial and clean tech ecosystem. And it is quite peculiar that in July 2021, the European Union struck a strategic partnership with Ukraine in order to diversify supply chains for rare earths and other types of critical minerals, and in order to try and bring Ukraine within the European path towards an energy transition by creating an industrial pact. It was in July 2021. Most of the deposits are located in the eastern part of the country. A few months later, we have the invasion that started. And for now, we're seeing a tactical play where Ukraine is thankfully regaining a lot of its territory, but Russia was aiming and still aims for access to these different materials. Why do I uphold this theory? Well, it's because Ukraine is not the only case in town. Back in 2018, I was in the Central African Republic. Back in 2018 was the year when the Wagner Group was introduced in the Central African Republic to try and help with the stabilization of the country, something which was very odd for a lot of people like me who were working in political mediation and stabilization. We saw the Wagner Group arrive in Bangui, and then we saw it being dispatched in a country where 80% of the territory is controlled by armed groups and where it's inaccessible to the Central African state. If you look at this slide, on the left-hand side, you have a map of the various deposits. The blue dots are actually gold and diamonds. Please don't take care of so much of the blue dots, except for the fact that you see that they're located in the same place as the gray dots. The gray dots represent the many other minerals that we need to decarbonize. And the reason why I chose to talk about the Central African Republic today is because this country is usually not associated to the energy transition. It's usually not represented in maps for deposits. But having been there myself, I know that it's a country that has a lot of rare earths, a lot of silver, a lot of copper, a lot of cobalt, and a lot of other stuff that we need. And interestingly, when you look at the right-hand side of the slide, the orange dot locate the presence of the Wagner Group, whereas the gray dots locate the size of civilian casualties. There is a correlation between the Wagner presence and the mineral extraction potential. The Wagner Group is not currently extracting those minerals. They are testing the grounds. They are exploring. We know from having talked with a number of Central Africans in the country, outside of the capital, that a number of planes come in and out very often and take away a lot of minerals with them to try and sample, because this is how mining exploration works. And if it were just Ukraine and the Central African Republic, we could consider that Russia is an odd player within the energy transition. But it's not. I was in Madagascar also this summer to try and explore essentially what is happening with the number of mines that are being exploited for the energy transition. Lo and behold, Stork and Fair Mining, two companies that are associated to the Wagner Group, acquired a chromite mine. Chromite is used for solar panels. Chromite that they actually acquired at a very low production price, and the benefits were increased or doubled because they were selling their production to China. And the reason or the way in which they acquired the chromite mine is actually by supporting the current Malagasy president in his electoral campaign. So just with those three examples, with Ukraine, we have a case of outright aggression to try and gain access to a number of different minerals or hydrocarbons or uranium deposits that Europe and other regions of the world are going to need for their collective transition. In the Central African Republic, we see the deployment of a number of mercenaries to try and gain access to those deposits, not currently being exploited, but keeping them very warm until the moment when it's needed. And then in Madagascar, we have a case essentially of political usurpation and manipulation of socioeconomic underdevelopment, as well as fragility to serve industrial, geoeconomic, and industrial purposes, the means of which actually serve a larger end goal, which is for Russia to ride the wave that China has created in terms of turning supply chain concentration to their own advantage. China, as Professor Stiglitz was saying this morning, has been the world's factory for over 20 years. If I were not concerned with the way that China is turning that to their advantage, I would be in complete awe at how they turned the table around in terms of how to acquire the means, essentially, of controlling a lot of economic outposts in the way that the global, sort of economy functions. But there is a danger in how China is actually managing to turn the energy transition into a process of changing the world's global balance of power and acquiring the means to establish a new sense of economic hegemony, according to their own terms. I've already mentioned that the European Union is 98% dependent on China for rare earths, but the European Union and the rest of the world is also fundamentally dependent on China for the processing of lithium, cobalt, tantalum, and other types of products. Which means that while Europe has been busy trying to focus essentially on curating a homegrown clean tech innovation hub, by trying to push on standards, by trying to push on clean tech innovation, but completely forgetting that clean tech actually depends on functional mining and industrial supply chains, we find ourselves at the mercy, potentially, of supply chain weaponization, which has quite a lot of implications, because we are, by now, because of our climate law, or thanks to our climate law, accountable to the younger generations, but also to a social pact where we have no choice but to deliver by 2030 on greenhouse gas reduction targets. And this is obviously very much needed because the planet depends on it. But at the moment, what Europe has been missing is that while it was busy focusing on the financial, technical issues of the transition, it completely blindsided itself by not looking at the reality that a geopolitical play is playing as part of the transition, and that this geopolitical play requires a foreign and defense policy. It requires another type of intelligence going forward, and it requires a very agile, a very nimble type of relationship curation with the countries that are not just well endowed in the resources that we need. They are also on the front line of climate change and ecological collapse, and they are on the front line of the manipulation and instrumentalization of fragility. All of these different aspects now come together in terms of letting us know or giving us a sense of where Europe can be headed. We should not just look at the technical foundations of the transition. We should fundamentally rethink the way in which we interact with neighbors and with countries in Latin America, Africa, and in the Indo-Pacific. We should try and understand the type of transition models and business models that China, Russia, and other countries are using to create very unhealthy dependencies with those countries, and what that means in terms of the type of instruments, the type of investments, the type of political relationships that Europe will be able to engage in with in the future with those countries. And I'll just finish there. The reality is that Europe is going to have to change its mindset about the notion of how climate change is playing out. I engage quite a lot with a number of climate ambassadors on a very specific topic, which is usually called climate security. And climate security for the past 15 years has been associated to, those climate impacts playing out in Somalia, in Afghanistan, in all those different places. We're not the same. We're not the same. We're solid, we're resilient, and we're going to have the means to cope whatever happens. The reality is that for the moment, Europe doesn't have the means of its ambitions, and that climate impacts are starting to hit extremely hard. So we're going to have to bring home the concept of climate security to understand essentially that this notion of security and international stability now concerns us. It plays out on many different aspects. It plays out in industrial policy. It plays out on political issues regarding the use of disinformation, for example, to fragment Europe from a political perspective within Europe and outside of Europe. It plays out in terms of usurpation of political systems and accountability. It plays out in terms of using fragility, corruption, and predation to the advantage of those who want to upset the current balance of power. And that means essentially that two of our principal aims in Europe should be to try and make sure that we do acquire the means of our ambitions, including starting to mine again in Europe, where it is possible and where it ecologically makes sense, and trying to also look towards the countries that we should be heavily invested into, not just from an industrial perspective, but from an adaptation perspective. And this is a new proposition that Europe should go about developing today, because the name of the game has changed from just mitigation to adaptation, and we need to have a different type of diplomatic and security proposition going forward. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Huge challenges ahead, and revealing what many people are not aware of, and that is the dependencies that you have talked about. But I give the floor to Julian Popov, who will now give his presentation, and after that we will do a Q&A. Julian.
Thank you. Do I have to press something here?
No, you're
No,
okay.
Everything's okay. Thank you. I'm the last speaker. Everything has been said already. So I'll just add here and there a few things. Regarding the last presentation, if you want to chase an interesting story, look who is the climate change ambassador and advisor of Vladimir Putin. It's Ruslan Dodgirev, who used to be the right-hand man of Kadyrov, and he was prime minister of Chechnya. He doesn't know anything about climate change, but he is kind of young and very ambitious. And before the war, he was the counterpart of John Kerry on the Russian side. So if you want to dig there, there is a lot of digging. And of course, the other thing is Wagner and what Olivia was saying about all the relationship with mining and corruption, and do help a little bit in comparing the EU-Africa summit with the EU-Russia summit. Just go on the websites of the two to see that the EU-Russia summit is much, much better organized, much more focused on oil, gas, extractive industries and corruption. And EU-Russia summit is entirely based on memorandums of understanding and nothing else. So the question of EU foreign policy related to all these issues, including energy diplomacy, which is sort of my space. I was even energy ambassador at some point. Is a great gap in the European Union, which is a genetic gap, because the European Union was set up not as an internationally looking body, but as an inward-looking body. And if we look at the declaration, Schuman Declaration, which sort of set up the European Union, or started what we call now European Union, it is all about avoiding war inside, but not about outside. An interesting fact from this declaration is that there are 3 geographies mentioned there. One is Germany, the other is France, and the third is Africa. Africa is totally forgotten, and the EU doesn't have any foreign, I mean, it has foreign, something like foreign minister, but doesn't have any foreign policy, and that's a major, major problem now. So back to the energy crisis, I said that everything has been said. I would especially thank Professor Stiglitz and Professor Busch Professor Stiglitz for the introducing and emphasizing the issue of war economy. I've been advocating that for the last 6 months with incredible frustration and on all levels in the European Union. But also what Professor Busch was saying that, well, don't worry. I mean, things are okay. So do we have an energy crisis? Yes, we have energy crisis. Should we worry about that? Yes, we should worry. Like in any crisis, we should react on that. But there is a big difference between crisis, serious crisis, severe crisis, disaster, and tragedy. And when media deals with these realities, they start from not from the crisis, but from the tragedy. They first ask, is there a tragedy? If there is no tragedy, can we invent it? If the reality is opposing that, then they go to disaster. And if that doesn't work, then they move to crisis and say, well, I mean, it's a very, very serious crisis. And that's how we generate all the stories about blackouts and so on. Not that blackouts are something very, very, it's not a tragedy. I mean, in the 90s, I lived through blackouts in Bulgaria. Every 2 hours that electricity was stopped. But blackouts are usually system issues. They are not so much that there is no electricity. There is electricity, but the markets and the system doesn't work very well. You have to control it in that way. Now the control of the electricity system is much better. There is plenty of energy around. We have to reorganize all that energy. But what is the nature of the crisis? So we focus very much on the war in Ukraine and said, well, the war in Ukraine produced the energy crisis. Well, there are several other things. So first, of course, the COVID crisis came. The COVID crisis, if you think about that, took out of the economy billions and billions and billions of working days. Just took them out, disappeared. People are staying at home, being paid in the Western world, so-called at least, and they were not working. And then the lockdowns finished, and everybody who wanted to stay at home rather than going to work was saying, I don't feel well, so I'm not coming to work. So more and more working days have been disappearing. But this is a very, very strange economic crisis. I mean, I find it very kind of embarrassing in front of Professor Stiglitz to talk about economy, but it's not a crisis that is kind of triggered by deep economic processes. It's just suddenly the economy was externally stopped. And it had this kind of elastic element in it, that the energy of the economy was being contained. And at some point when the lockdown finished, this containment was released and the economy jumped up all over the world. And all the things that had to be done during COVID and people were not doing them, they didn't disappear, they were just postponed. I mean, imagine this, I don't know, let's say Europe has 500 million citizens, and if they're all good citizens, they would go once a year to a dentist. And imagine that for 1 year, 500 million people don't go to a dentist, and the next year there will be 1 billion going to the dentist rather than 500 million. So obviously the system of dentists is collapsing, and it is collapsing. And it's the same with energy, it's the same with many other things. The supply chain was severely damaged, and maintenance work, things that had to be done anyway, had to be kind of done later. And now we have this, there are no people. I mean, there's nobody to work. There's no unemployment in the Western world. So all these mechanisms of the economy are somehow working in a very kind of odd way. At the same time, during COVID, there was a massive savings. I mean, somewhere in the middle of the lockdown, the UK had generated 125 billion pounds additional savings, and people wanted to spend them, so they started spending them. So this kind of fueled suddenly spending naturally led to higher energy demand, but with disrupted supply chains. So then the price of gas started growing. And here, I mean, I'm sure you're all journalists, at least 10% of you are conspiracy theorists, otherwise you will, I mean, that's part of the job sometimes. One wonders whether there was sort of not some bright criminal minds around Putin who is saying, well, there is a crisis and we can kind of push into the crisis and sort of let's exacerbate it. And that's what happened last year when Europe started moving out of the crisis. Russia started reducing its gas supplies. They were still honoring their contracts, but when Europe needed more gas, that gas was not supplied. And then the prices started going up. And that was a major sort of act of market manipulation, which a normal trade partner would not do. I mean, you have a contract, but if you need more than the contract and your partner has the supply, will supply this. I mean, that's the normal kind of trade relations. Russia was not doing that. They were withholding. And the International Energy Agency in January, with quite a delay, warned that basically Putin is withholding gas supplies and manipulating the market. The problem with Europe is that that was the moment, at about a year ago, when Europe had to have this wartime strategy, not for gas, I would say for resource resilience. Any resources, any energy resources, anything to do with electricity, gas, coal, oil, wood, everything. And think what we should do if we have if this crisis become from a normal crisis, start becoming serious crisis and moving to a severe crisis, which we're somewhere there. And no disaster, no tragedy, but we're somewhere between serious crisis and severe crisis of energy. But Europe was not doing that and refusing to develop this sort of a normal kind of a wartime demand reaction. And it is exactly that what Europe had to do. I mean, in war, you reduce demand because there is no enough supply. Not only there is no enough supply, but something will be blown up and you don't know what exactly. So you have to be prepared to shrink supply, demand in a much more managed, better managed way. But when a politician say, well, we have to reduce the temperature by 1 degree, and the entire Europe is up in arms. When the European Commission introduced the restrictions on the old light bulbs, I mean, that was a revolution. There was a revolution when they introduced the standards for vacuum cleaners, because vacuum cleaners, there was even a story of a vacuum cleaner company that, one of the famous companies, that were making vacuum cleaners a little bit noisier because that makes them sound more powerful. And the headline power of a vacuum cleaner does not translate in any way into its efficiency. So when the European Commission said, you will not use vacuum cleaners, which are 1,600 watts, but you reduce it to 900, I mean, that was almost a revolution in the European Union. And nobody thought that actually 900 could work much better than 1,600 if it's properly designed. And that's what happened. I mean, the vacuum cleaner companies just moved there, and now vacuum cleaners are better, and they save much more energy. So these are the type of things that voters hate being told what to do with their vacuum cleaners, with their light bulbs, and so on. But this is in a wartime situation, you have to say. I mean, we have to manage all that. We made calculations, and I chair the main think tank in Brussels that is dealing with energy demand, so I'm a little bit kind of obsessed with that subject. But we managed some calculations about what can be done. So, for example, loft insulation. Loft insulation is something that is very easy. I mean, any of you can go to the shop, buy the kind of special insulation wool, go to the loft and put it there, and that's it. It's very easy. It can save 14% of the heat demand, and the energy demand is very much heat. Energy crisis is very much heat crisis. It's not so much electricity crisis at the moment. But nobody said, well, go and do something about your lofts. There is a big story in UK about condensing boilers. I'm sorry that I'm talking about the most boring things on earth, but basically, all condensing boilers, which are the new efficient boilers, and the whole UK is covered with them, are tuned at high temperature of 75 degrees so that they produce good heat. But when your boiler is 75 degrees, it doesn't condense. So it has to be under 65. When it's under 65, then it's much more efficient with exactly the same effect. And nobody knows that. And nobody would say, I mean, Liz Truss would come and say, it is a supply thing. We have to find the supplies. It's not about the supplies, stupid. It's about the demand. It's about managing the demand. And managing the demand, you can match the crisis of the supply by managing the demand. And this is not happening. And of course, the other thing that is not happening, and it is a major issue, is, and Professor Stiglitz was mentioning that, about the pushing of the, and the installation of the renewable energy. I mean, here I will say a few words about the renewable energy, because you will hear many people saying two things. One, it's the Greens' fault, the whole thing. And the other one is, no, the green stuff is wonderful, but we have to postpone it a little bit because there is a crisis now. Both statements are complete crap. I mean, they are factually wrong. I mean, I'm taking my sort of a climate identity and belonging completely out of this, and let's talk just about the facts, I mean, about the data. This year, solar energy in the summer, solar energy in Europe saved 20 billion cubic meters of gas and 29 billion euros of money that we would have paid to Russia or to some other democratic country like that to get the gas in. So the problem is not that there is green energy, there is not enough green energy, or the transition is not managed properly and with clear understanding. And the transition is not managed properly because there is a deep misunderstanding and wrong understanding about the energy and the energy economics. People who are working in governments and manage national strategies, they're educated people, but they're educated in a different world. The energy economics in the last 10 years, 5 years even, but let's say 10 years, and certainly all the people who manage the strategies and run countries have been educated longer than 10 years ago. In the last 10 years, the energy economics was turned upside down. Everything that was expensive became cheap, and everything that was cheap became expensive. I mean, the renewables, I remember when we were in the COP15 in Copenhagen, and then the main debate was renewables are very, very expensive, but we must have them because of climate. That's totally invalid now because renewables are just the cheapest ones. The cheapest energy comes from renewable energy. So at the same time, coal became expensive. Nuclear used to be very cheap. Nuclear became the most expensive energy. And my guess is that after the Ukrainian war, nuclear will become much more expensive, because the reason nuclear is expensive is because it has a lot of security protocols that have to be followed. I mean, think about it. The biggest nuclear power station have been bombed and attacked by a large group of gangsters who are threatening the world with nuclear attacks, and they're bombing the biggest nuclear power station in Europe. So what do you think will happen as a result of that? I mean, every single citizen group, energy group, will start insisting on additional security measures, additional safety measures of nuclear power. That will put cost of nuclear power, I guess, with 25% up, maybe more. I mean, after Fukushima, it went 70, 80% up. So renewable energy will become prohibitively expensive. Even I'm a supporter of nuclear energy, but it's just very expensive. Coal became very expensive because of environmental constraints and also the carbon markets. But we can't suspend that. I mean, the idea that we'll suspend carbon markets is kind of just no starter. And also the carbon price contributes very, very, very little to the cost of energy at the moment. At the same time, it's not just this shifting between the very cheap becoming expensive and the very expensive becoming cheap, but also the way energy is kind of distributed. Energy used to be very centralized commodity. I mean, you have a power station that is I don't know, 1 gigawatt, 2 gigawatts, and it produces electricity and sends it from one center to everybody. So everything that was centralized now is becoming highly decentralized. So it requires different market. But the different market should come very much because of that kind of decentralization is one thing. At the same time, things that were centralized, decentralized before, started becoming not exactly centralized, but coordinated, like a sort of artificial intelligence coordinated. I don't like very much the idea of artificial intelligence, but so, for instance, even in the darkest time of communism, it was up to you when you would turn your light up or on or off. In modern world, you are in a connected system in which your lights start turning on and off because of, I don't know, some kind of a network that covers your house, covers your entire country. And this is the concept of demand-side management, which is very, very important. And that is also part of the solving the whole problem. So when we discuss the market design and market, because there is a lot of discussion on market design, at the moment the debate is very much focused on let's not allow people to make excessive profits, companies to make excessive profits. And they do make excessive profits. The question for me is whether we can find mechanisms in the existing market system that can control that and regulate that, or we have to fundamentally change the market. And I personally would prefer to see the existing markets being regulated a little bit better and also to explore all the mechanisms in the existing markets. For instance, that started from UK mostly, but the contracts for difference. I mean, the contracts for difference are a fantastic mechanism which fixes the price of energy for the future for a long time. And then you have this contract, and if the market is very weak, the government or the society or the fund for energy security or something else pays you the difference between the low market price and what you have agreed. So you have this predictability, and the company is helped by some public fund. But what happens now, all the companies that are on contracts for difference, they're printing money for the government. So state companies print money for the government, but also companies with fixed longer-term prices produce massive amount of money, which are helping to compensate the system. So I think this is the area to look at, how to sort of fix that side of the market. And this is just a comment on what we were discussing earlier. And the last thing that I will say again on the market, on how to deal with the excessive profits. yes, we can impose windfall tax, for instance. I mean, that has been done by Tony Blair and many, but it's kind of a quite extreme case. I would wonder whether tax incentives for investing excessive profits into energy efficiency and renewable energy would not be the better way, because then you don't disrupt and redesign the whole market, but you use existing mechanisms. And I would be very interested to hear opinions of people who know a little bit, not a little bit, much more about economics than I do. I know political economics and taxes. So to summarize everything that I was saying in my views is that this is to a large extent a self-inflicted crisis. It is self-inflicted because of political laziness and complacency, of not thinking about obvious risks. You can't become totally dependent or very highly dependent on Russia for anything. I mean, look at Turkey. I mean, Turkey was dependent, and then they said, well, we don't want to be dependent, and now Turkey tripled their gas import capacity. And if Russia stops their gas, they have 2 times more capacity to import gas from all sorts of other places, including they have enough LNG terminals to supply the whole of Southeast Europe through them. But the European Union and European countries have been very, very complacent, very lazy, very there's this term about the youngsters that they're snowflake generation. I think Europe is a snowflake continent, and that must change, and we have to face that reality. And whether we call it a war or whatever we call it, we have to think in a much more sort of a risk reduction approach and mind. So thank you. I hope it was.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian, on that snowflake metaphor. We have very little time, so I'll take one round of questions. So we'll start there, then Joseph Stiglitz, and then back there. Yeah.
Well, I'm from EDM Institute for the Danube region, Central Europe, Grauchenberg. I have a question to Mrs. Lazard. It's concerning, you said, of course, which is perfectly right, it's a problem that Europe did not look at the supply side for rare earths, etc. However, we have also the legal objections in nearly all of the European countries. It takes 10 years to have a tension line. A rare species can stop any project. So how do you see that it is realistic at all that these plans of the EU may come on stream? We also have an example in Austria for rare earth lithium, which is the biggest source of Europe in Carinthia. It was sold a few years ago for €1 to an Australian company with, I think, some Chinese influence. And you still can block all these projects because of legal objections. It takes endless time. Thank you.
Okay, Joe.
Yeah, thank you both for very interesting presentations. I have 3 questions for Olivia. The first is, the U.S. is trying to break relations with China. I mean, there's a new Cold War, and your figures about the world's dependence on Chinese rare earth or everything were very startling. If China and the U.S. really did break off relations, how terrible would it be? Would it be a crisis? How quickly are we able to develop alternative sources and, as you pointed out, processing capabilities, because you distinguish between that. It's very interesting. The second thing is, you described how we are very dependent on all these minerals. If we had fully priced the social cost of these minerals and maybe even corruption and the risk, would we have the capacity of developing renewable energy sources that were not so dependent on outside? So for instance, I mean, yes, these are better windmills than we might have if we didn't use the rare, these other but could we get along with maybe more synthetic materials that were not so dependent? You know, had we provided the right incentives, would we have a different dependency in our whole renewable system on these? And the third question is, given that we've fallen so far behind in control of the natural resources that China has gotten and Russia have gotten control of so much, to what extent, and often through Western subsidiaries, to what extent do investment agreements that make it difficult for those to be aggregated and for them to be reorganized? In other words, if Russia bought these resources through a Netherlands subsidiary that has an investment agreement with Congo, DRC, it can't abrogate it without being sued. So have we gotten ourselves with our international agreements into a tangle? And then, Julian, I had two questions or comments. The first is, I agree very much that it's the structure of demand, not the aggregate demand, including the structure of demand in energy, and that we could have done a lot, we could do a lot through regulations to quickly reduce energy demand. But the overall picture on inflation that you described, we've looked at, I haven't looked at it for Europe, but for the United States, it's very clear that we do not have an aggregate demand problem. That in fact, aggregate demand in the United States is below trend, before the trend that existed before 2019. That yes, there were huge reserves that were built up, but economic theory and the empirical evidence shows that they are not being spent down. For an obvious reason, that people were going to spread it over their lives, and they faced enormous amount of uncertainty. And that has led them to high levels of precautionary balances. So while it was right for us to be worried that that might happen, it hasn't happened. And the current inflation has nothing or almost nothing to do with this aggregate demand. And that's the reason why I emphasize this big source of controversy in the United States, with Larry Summers arguing that, and Republicans arguing that it was excessive spending in the pandemic that led to the current crisis. They're totally wrong. So, you know, in a way, what you were saying weighed into that particular debate, and I wanted to just make sure that, you know, that particular interpretation of what's happened is not correct. Finally, I think that the reforms that need to be done to the European energy system are more fundamental. As I mentioned, I think in my talk, California tried deregulation of the form that Europe had, and it was a disaster. And Europe should have learned from that mistake, and that the volatility, the windfall profits taxes, profits are allow for the deduction of investment and capital and labor, and our windfall profits taxes are not distortionary. It is a good idea to provide incentives, both penalties and carrots and sticks, for doing more resilient, more greener energy investment. But the windfall profits taxes, particularly, I mean, example of the traders, the speculators who are making huge windfall profits taxes. Why should that not be taxed? You know, they didn't do anything really to deserve their huge profits. And it's not only in energy, it's in food, it's in other areas. And, you know, this is wartime, and in wartime, you execute people who are wartime profiteering. I'm not calling for the execution of these people, but I do think a wartime profits tax would be, and a more fundamental reform of the energy system would be called for.
Good. And finally, back there.
Thank you. Peter Magyari, journalist from Hungary, Budapest. I would like to ask Mr. Popov about the 5 new ideas from the European Commission how to react on the high energy prices, from the windfall tax until the cap ideas. Is any of them could be useful? And if you have favorite out of them, which would be? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Back to our panel, and Olivia first.
I'm gonna take your questions in a bundle because they actually go together. If you look at the way the European Commission is reacting to the current energy crisis and supply crisis, there is a new sort of mantra in Brussels, which is permit, 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 permit. And it's permit to install end-use infrastructure in terms of the wind turbines and solar farms, which is already quite a problem. Well, it raises a lot of issues, and that's why there is a rush essentially towards offshoring a lot of the infrastructure in the Mediterranean and the North Sea and potentially in the Atlantic. But there is also this general sort of impetus to say, well, we do need to mine more. We do need more mines, so we're going to have to procure them somewhere or another. But then comes a question which you raised. Australia, for example, acquired a lithium mine in Austria. So I'm currently involved in a study where I'm looking at the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kazakhstan, Brazil, Myanmar, and Madagascar, and a number of other countries. I see a lot of Chinese companies. I see a few Russian companies. I see Glencore, Australian-American, or Anglo-American, sorry. I see Rio Tinto, but I don't see a lot of so-called homegrown European companies of the Eramet style, for example. So where are they? There are two different things to think about here. One relates to what Professor Stiglitz was saying this morning. There is a part where we've come to a crunch in the global economy, specifically for Europe, that doesn't work in terms of ideology. The market ideology is not serving the purpose of the transition. So Professor Stiglitz, you were saying it in terms of, like the energy crisis per se, but I'm looking at it from the supply side perspective, where if you look at what is happening in China, you have state-owned enterprises, which not only do they have many, but when it comes, for example, to rare earth mining and rare earth processing, they're now creating a merged gigafactory or giga mining actor, a compound of 6 different mining companies, which they can deploy wherever they want to, because they have this notion that industrial policy, energy policy, climate policy is foreign and defense policy. So you're going to find, for example, that in the DRC, 15 out of 17 different mines, cobalt mines, are owned by Chinese companies. The other 2 are Glencore. You can reproduce that in Chile, for example, where they're extremely active in lithium mining. You can reproduce that in the US, where they've actually acquired some processing plants. You can reproduce that in Canada, where we've just learned about 2 months ago that the Canadian government actually allowed for Chinese companies to acquire mining and operating assets in Canada. They have a way of playing by the rules of the game and turning them to their advantage. In Europe, we have not understood that. That's one. The second part is, if we have some companies that still operate according to a business model which is essentially just market-oriented and not geopolitical and potentially wartime, but also transition-oriented, and therefore trying to help in terms of de-risking investments for mining, operations, but also trying to sort of help in terms of the price fluctuations, because this is also something that China is playing on. I'll give you just one example. When Indonesia is thinking about raising quotas in terms of nickel provision and supply chains, usually China is behind this. What the effect it has is essentially to raise the price of nickel in the clean tech environment and ecosystems, including in Europe. It raises the prices, it dampens the competition. Or for that matter, when you have China trying to acquire mining assets and try to overflood markets so that the prices fall. Because the result is essentially going to be that a number of OECD-related companies are going to look at copper fluctuation in terms of prices and say, well, maybe not worth the investment. Maybe not now, maybe later. So we're finding ourselves in a complete competitive void here, and a complete schizophrenia, as you were saying, there is a strategic sequencing which is not happening in Europe, where if you want to invest in clean tech, for God's sake, try to look at the industrial part in the first place, and try to look at how you can sustain your economy in the clean tech world, not just in terms of competition and innovation, but in terms of how supply chains, geopolitics, and geoeconomics are changing. The last point that I will make is, yes, it takes time to look at the biodiversity components, the natural landscapes. This is important. Because at the end of the day, I come from a background where ecology matters. We have no choice but to sustain and to nurture and to regenerate natural landscapes. Our lifeline depends on it. If we go into a new industrial expansion era, at the expense of planetary boundaries, decarbonization is going to be the end of us. As much as it needs to happen, we need to decarbonize fast, but we need to decarbonize well. And that's what makes a difference for potentially European companies or so-called OECD companies, where there are some standards that need to be respected. But these standards need to be accompanied by government backing and de-risking and ability essentially to organize a supply ecosystems accompanying the clean tech ecosystem. In terms of the decoupling question, so this is one of the questions that keeps me up at night, because technically to open up a mine and to have it operate properly, you need between 7 and 15 years, depending on the actual sort of location on the mine, on the type of material, the concentration, the quality of the ore, and the sort of supply chain rationalization. So the US wanting to decouple, well, technically in the US you have a lot more minerals relatively compared to Europe. So there is a potential rationale, and the Inflation Reduction Act is essentially trying to sort of leapfrog into the industrial phase and to try and accelerate by creating business incentives to really to push essentially industrial operatives to move into that space of clean energy and clean tech. The issue, once again, here is that a lot of the deposits are usually located in either fairly densely populated areas or in indigenous lands. This is also something quite specific for the US, so there's going to be a lot of domestic reticence in that direction, of a different kind compared to Europe, but the result of this is the same. So how quickly are we going to be able to reconstruct essentially an industrial ecosystem? I'm not sure. I'm not sure, first of all, because it depends on, one, democratic conversations that need to happen. Climate activists and environmental activists need to understand that decarbonization is industrial policy. And industrial policy is reorganization of monetary policy, of debt policy, of territorial policy for that matter. That conversation is not taking place in Europe. I'm not seeing a lot of it in terms of there are some opportunity costs to shifting energy systems. We have to take them, but they have to be accompanied, and for the moment, it's not even part of the information bubble or the democratic discourse. The second part, once again, is we need know-how. We need to really sort of go about recovering a mining industry which is effective, which is compliant very quickly with a lot of different standards in Europe and in the US. And if we want to do it in a way that somehow decouples from China, even relatively, we have to do it together. And I recall during the Trump era, the moment when President Trump wanted to buy Greenland, which is very resource endowed. We're facing in Europe the worry of an unstable ally, and we're not quite sure how long we're going to be able to call it an ally. So even for us, we don't quite know what type of industrial ecosystem it creates in Europe and abroad, or in terms of alliances. And yet this is what would facilitate and accelerate essentially this new industrial revolution of some kind. Material substitution and recycling, these are really strong sort of core tenets of the Green Deal and of the way that the European actors are looking essentially at the way in which we can do a transition towards a mineral industry. The problem is that there is only so much material substitution that you can do. So Finnish actors, for example, in the battery space, said, well, we really don't want to go and extract cobalt in the DRC because this is very sort of sensitive in terms of human rights and extraction and things like this. So we're going to try and increase the level of nickel, for example, in terms of our battery composition, which means that we switch dependency from the DRC to Indonesia. And Indonesia is in and of itself an ally of some sort, also a bit unstable, also very close to China. So there are many different things that we need to think about. In terms of recycling, very quick answer on this, the OECD, the Joint Research Center of Europe, and the World Bank all estimates that we need at least another 15 years of primary extraction before we can reach a circularity of economy which is full, which is closed. So there's no way around it. We need to mine. And we need to sort of understand what we mine for. And this is the next challenge for Europe. At the end of the day, we cannot sustain an energy intensivity, which is what we have today. We have to change economic modeling, and everybody is getting very, very polarized about this at the moment, you know, like degrowth and post-economic modeling and things like this. I'm very agnostic about this. What I know is that essentially the way in which we do carbon accounting in Europe is unfortunately partially wrong, because we outsource a lot of our emissions outside of Europe. And that if you look in terms of accounting at resource and material footprint, we usually use about 2.5 planets per year. For the US, it's about 4 planets per year. That's way beyond what we can sustain. So we're going to have to change the way in which we do economic metabolism. We just don't know what's next in terms of modeling and how it relates essentially to international relations. And how do we, if I may sort of rephrase your question, if I understood it correctly, the legal frameworks that currently tie certain actors to deposits, can we undo them? Can we change them? This all depends on national jurisdiction. So for example, Fair Mining and Stork, which own 3 different permits in Madagascar for chromite mining, if you look into the details of the contract, there are certain things that if they don't honor them, then the contract is void, it's annulled, essentially. And there are every likelihood that these sort of Wagner-associated companies may not be able to comply legally with a lot of the different mining, components of the contract. So the more we become nimble at understanding essentially how to support national jurisdictions within Africa, Latin America, etc., in terms of the reform of mining codes, and there are many reforms going on in the world, is precisely on this, because these countries have understood that these minerals are very much in demand and that we need to move towards a better appreciation market-wise of these commodities and how to play on competition. The more we're going to be able to sustain also a way in which, at least I hope, Europe can potentially place itself on a historical trend where it helps to build governance systems that make sure that the mining sector actually contributes to development, which has not been historically the case, that the mining sector can contribute to adaptation and in mitigation of their, sort of impacts, and that therefore there is a very strong industrial proposition in Europe and potentially in the US, Japan, Australia, to say we need to decarbonize, but we're going to do it in a way that is about co-industrialization, co-benefits of economic value, and that finally we may have a proper conversation about how to redistribute global welfare in a fair manner, because otherwise
Countries that are at the heart of the scramble for resources will say, you don't want us to use gas when you respond to the war in Ukraine? Well, too bad for you. We're going to play our own cards, and they're going to be against you. That's why there needs to be this sort of mindset change in Europe, saying our future depends on partnerships and alliances that are actually strong value propositions rather than self-interested only.
Julian.
I'm afraid I would be much less inspirational than that. First of all, I don't worry so much. I mean, if we look at the markets, for instance, now is the hype of the sort of the crisis narrative, but not in the market concern. I mean, we were expecting a month ago the gas to go through the roof and to continue. It reached almost 350 euros on TTF, and then at that moment, Putin started tightening the supplies to Europe, expecting that the next day probably it will go to 400 or 500. At the moment he started tightening further the supplies of gas to Europe, the market price of gas started going down. I was looking now, it went down and down. Today it went down 9%, further 9%. It's 175 euros at the moment. And there was a question about the market cap. I mean, the market cap, I personally don't know, can't imagine how that would work. But the market cap for Russian gas, was set at 200 euros. Well, I mean, the market did the job. I mean, it's under 200 euros, so there is no point putting this market cap. It would just kind of disrupt the market signals. And I think that you should interfere with the markets when they don't work. If they don't work, why should you fix something that works? It is similar the case with the rare metals, with metals in general. I mean, lithium went straight up in the skies, but since almost the beginning of this year, the lithium price is flat. And while demand for and market for electric cars has been very, very active and growing rapidly in Europe, at least, but in China massively. I didn't go into speculations why exactly the price of lithium is not going further up, but I think part of this growth was speculative and very extreme concern that, I don't know, the world is coming to an end, but it's not coming to an end. The same thing is with copper, with cobalt. I mean, the prices are flat or going down. I mean, they went down. People who were betting in the last 6 months on metals lost a lot of money, actually. So we should look into that a little bit kind of more calmly. The same thing about food. I mean, if we think about, we tend to think that we have we're expanding our agriculture to an unmanageable level. But what we see, the data shows that the agricultural land is slightly shrinking in the last 10 years, but production is going up, simply because agriculture is becoming more productive. So this balance between productivity and more advanced production and then also some more measured and better managed demand will probably lead us to out of tragedy and out of disaster, and we will live in a crisis that is normal because crisis is part of life. The point about the aggregated demand, I mean, I wasn't referring to the total aggregated demand. When I was speaking about resource efficiency. I mean, just things that are related to energy use, because there was a clear sign that there is a shortage of energy, and we're becoming too dependent on a single source, and that disaster could happen, so we should have been prepared for that. Where I don't agree with the Commission is this idea of let's reduce gas demand by 15%. We should say energy in general, because energy sources are interdependent. They're not completely replaceable. You can't replace coal with gas one-to-one. But when you reduce gas demand, you increase through complex chain, you increase illegal logging, for instance, for firewood. So if you focus, for instance, on efficiency and of domestic stoves that work on wood, you affect also the whole energy market, and that tampers a little bit also the gas demand. That was my point. And again, on the windfall profit, yes, they have to be addressed somehow, but again, I would favor pushing the windfall profits through incentives back into efficiency and renewables, because these are the companies that know how to invest in energy. And there is a risk that the government will take all the money, that's happening in Bulgaria, take all the money and give them to everybody, and take all more money and give them to everybody, in a system that favors richer people. Because if you start suppressing the energy price, you basically subsidize this energy price, and you give more subsidies to people who use more energy. So if you have 2 swimming pools and 5 CUVs, you get much more subsidies than somebody who is struggling to pay the bill for 1 light bulb. But the problem in Europe is that we don't have a good system for definition of addressing of energy poverty. Energy poverty is a very, very complex phenomenon. And you can't just say, oh, there is energy poverty, let's put price of electricity 20% down. It doesn't work. Or let's give to everybody who doesn't have enough money some money. Yes, but some people live in very small house, other people live in big house. Some houses are very well insulated, others are not. So this is a very complex system. This is not developed, and that has to be developed in order to put these excessive profits or other public funds to target people who really need it, and not people who will just benefit simply because they're bigger users. And the other thing is we see now gas demand in Europe has declined significantly because of high prices. I mean, the price signals are important for increasing energy efficiency. So we have to keep them somehow in some form without damaging and punishing people who can't afford to pay their bills. And about the 5 measures of the Commission, too late, too little, and not all completely relevant. Some are interesting. I mean, the windfall tax, it's a proposition from the Commission. It's very difficult for them to impose it. It's something that national governments should do, but national governments are already doing that. Almost all national government, the British government was not doing it. Now Liz Truss decided to do it in the most radical possible way. So most governments are doing that redistribution and using windfall taxes or some other mechanisms to compensate the high prices. I'm very much in support of demand, the measures related to the demand side, but they are too late. I mean, you need something. So you need some time to change windows, to change stuff, to increase energy efficiency. And I'm not very much in favor of making people suffer with low temperatures. So better do something so that we use energy in a more efficient way rather than say, okay, live at 12 degrees. And there is an interesting point about the peak demand in this. I mean, peak demand is something that we can address with digitalization and with intelligence, including artificial intelligence. And we can address with many things. I mean, these light bulbs, if we change them, I mean, this light, well, they're on the whole day, but usually you have a peak demand because of lighting. I mean, part of the reason, the evening peak demand. If you change all the light bulbs in Europe with LED light bulbs, which are paid back in 1 or 2 years, probably with these prices in 6 months, you will soften this peak consumption significantly every day, because LED lights are 10 times more efficient than the very old ones. So, I mean, so it's a mixed bag, the European approach. It reminds me very much of the early days of the European reaction to COVID, which was a disaster.
Thank you. Join me, please, in thanking both Olivia and Julian. Thank you all very much for coming. I will spare you my concluding remarks. That is for over lunch or coffee or wherever else we're going this afternoon. I'd like to thank our co-organizers, Concordia, Erste Stiftung, fjum, Mirjana Tomić, who's there sitting at the back, and Professor Stiglitz once again for his keynote and for sticking with us for this really wealthy discussion that we had from both panels. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivan and Concordia.